Good afternoon, all. Are we almost ready to get started? Good afternoon, all. Are we almost ready to get started? Okay, I'll begin by starting out with some administrative remarks, and then I'll hand it off to Dr. Morris to continue with the agenda. My name is Sue Shalal, and I am the designated federal officer for the SAB Hexavalent Chromium Review Panel. This panel was assembled to review EPA's draft toxicological review of hexavalent chromium. In addition to today's meeting, the review panel is also scheduled to meet on March 29th to the 31st in Arlington, Virginia, to deliberate on the charge questions. And as always, all materials pertaining to this review, including the documents to be reviewed, charge questions, agendas, public comments, as well as today's presentations by EPA representatives and other documents as they are developed can be accessed on the SAB website associated with this SAB advisory activity. At this time, in my role as DFO, I would like to formally open today's public meeting. And before I continue, I have some remarks regarding the transmission of this meeting. For everyone that's listening in today, the panel is meeting via a Zoom video conferencing format, which is being broadcast live through both audio and YouTube video connections. And you can find the call-in information and a link to the video webcast by going to the main SAB webpage at epa.gov/SAB and clicking on today's meeting date under the heading titled Meetings and Events. The SAB is an independent expert federal advisory committee chartered under the authority of the Federal Advisory Committee Act, or FACA. The SAB is empowered by the Environmental Research, Development, and Demonstration Authorization Act, or ERDA, to provide advice to the EPA administrator on the scientific and technical underpinnings of the EPA's decisions. FACA and EPA policy require that SAB meetings be announced to the public in the Federal Register, and that substantive deliberations and interactions with EPA and the public be conducted in open session, where I, as DFO, am present to ensure that the requirements of FACA are met. FACA also requires that during public meetings, opportunities for oral and written public comments are provided. There is a public comment period noted on today's agenda where members of the public can register in advance with the SAB staff office to make oral comments. At today's meeting, we have 7 members of the public who have registered to present oral comments. Members of the public also have an opportunity to provide written comments throughout the advisory period, and written comments will be distributed to the panel and posted on the SAB website. Minutes will be prepared to summarize discussions and action items for all of the panel's meetings in accordance with the requirements of FACA and will be posted on the SAB website. The SAB consists entirely of special government employees appointed by EPA to their positions as government employees. All members are subject to all applicable ethics laws and implementing regulations. The SAB staff office has reviewed the financial confidential financial disclosure form submitted by panel members along with other information related to their involvement in the development of materials related to the advisory activity under consideration. And EPA has determined that advisors participating in this meeting have no financial conflicts of interest or appearance of a lack of impartiality under ethics regulations specified in 5 CFR 2635 relating to the topic of this meeting. As a reminder, and since some members of the public may be listening to the discussions via a teleconference line, I would like to ask panel members to identify themselves when speaking. And before I hand the meeting over to Dr. Morris, I'm just going to go through the roster to see who is present today. Dr. Morris, are you on the line? Yes, you are, but you're muted. There
I'm not muted anymore.
Dr. Barbara Beck.
I'm here.
Thank you. Dr. Mark Bursak.
Yes, I'm here.
Yes, there you are. Dr. Eamon Chen.
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you. Dr. Max Costa.
I'm here.
Thank you. Dr. David Eastman.
I'm here.
Thank you. Mr. Joseph Haney.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Ben King.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. Lawrence Lash.
I'm here. Hi.
Thank you. Dr. Gloria Post. I see you there, Gloria. Thank you.
Present.
Dr. Christy Pullen-Fednick. I believe she said she would not be able to join us today. Dr. Ivan Rusin.
Here.
Thank you. Dr. Edwin Van Witchgarden.
Present.
Thank you. Dr. John Weiss.
Here.
Dr. Anatoly Zitkovich.
I'm here.
We'll you. Okay, so with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Morris. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. We'll just start off by welcoming you all and thank you for agreeing to participate in this panel. Do we have opening remarks from the Deputy Director, Ms. Johnston?
You're on mute, Kana.
I am so sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. My apologies. I was a little bit delayed joining. I had technical difficulties and just realized I was trying to move my computer so you wouldn't have this lovely glare behind me, but that takes me off the main server line, so it gave me some Wi-Fi issues. But first and foremost, we want to thank everyone for coming together today and for your willingness to serve on the IRIS panel for hexavalent chromium. We appreciate everyone's coming together and your commitment to provide EPA with your valuable input. As members of the panel, as you know, you will be asked to look at the review and the assessment that EPA has done to make sure that the review is clearly presented. Most importantly, is it scientifically supported? And finally, what recommendations you offer so that EPA can strengthen this assessment. You've met Sue. I'm always very humbled by our staff at EPA. And thank you for your willingness and the breadth of expertise that you all help us come together and bring together in this panel. Thank you for being willing to put forth the extra hours to help us. And with that, you will also hear from Dr. Chris Thayer and her team today so that you can further ask more information for the charge questions and get some additional information. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Morris. Once again, thank you, everyone, and that we are just absolutely humbled to have your presence with us today.
Okay, thank you very much. And I too would like to thank all of you for participating. It's really gratifying to see so many of the nation's experts willing to take time out of their schedules to work on this panel. Actually, I think I know a lot of you who are on this panel, many for more years than I care to admit, I suspect. And I look forward to working with all of you in Washington and getting away from Zoom meetings and actually being together face to face. I think that'll be much more effective. I think what we'll do at the face to face, we'll have full introductions of everyone and their expertise. But right now, we'll go through the roster just for a brief introduction. So if people could talk about their affiliation and their area of expertise, that would help all of the listeners on this call. I'm Dr. Morris. I'm an emeritus professor at the University of Connecticut. And while I was there, I was a member of the faculty of the toxicology program for 35 years, I guess it was. And my area of expertise is inhalation toxicology. So I'll just call out people's names and they can introduce themselves. And being traditional, we'll do it in alphabetic order. So first is Dr. Beck.
I will let you there so you can see what I look like. I'm a toxicologist and risk assessor at Gradient, which is an environmental consulting company. And I have particular expertise in metals toxicology, having worked on a whole range of metals for over 25 years now.
Thanks. Dr. Borsick.
Hi, I'm Mark Borsick. I'm a professor at the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering, Tract School of Engineering at Duke University. I'm also the co-director of the Duke Center on Risk. My area of interest is in quantitative assessments of risk, especially using Bayesian statistical methods and Bayesian modeling.
Okay, Dr. Chen.
Hi, this is Aimin Chen. I'm sorry, actually, I cannot get my video working, so I'll try to find out how to get it working. So I'm an environmental epidemiologist at the University of Pennsylvania, Permanent School of Medicine. So I do environmental epidemiologic studies, mostly on environmental metals, as well as endocrine disrupting chemicals. On the metals, I have more research on lead, cadmium, and mercury, certainly a little bit on chromium. So I'm happy to join the committee.
Thank you. Dr. Costa?
Yes, I'm professor in the Department of Medicine at NYU Medical School, and I head a division of environmental carcinogenesis. And my work is in many different metals, nickel, chromium, cadmium. I've been doing research on heavy metals for about 40 years.
Thank you. Dr. Eastman?
Yes, I'm a professor emeritus at the University of California, Riverside. My area of expertise is really genetic toxicology, chemical carcinogenesis, and some general experience and risk assessment as well.
Okay. Dr. Haney?
Yes, I'm Mr. Joseph Haney. I've worked at the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality as a toxicologist and risk assessor for the past almost 25 years. We support all programs at the TCQ, which includes dose response assessments and the derivation of tox factors under our own toxicity factor derivation guidelines. And in this case happens to include both dose response assessments of inhalation and oral pathways for hexavalent chromium.
Okay. Dr. King?
Hi, I'm an environmental epidemiologist as well at the University of Houston College of Medicine, actually recently renamed Tillman J. Fertitta College of Medicine here in Houston, Texas. I have some background as well teaching at UT Austin, environmental health and risk assessment, and came over to the UH Medical School, which newly formed in 2020, where I'm in the Department of Health Systems and Population Health Sciences, and also with the UH Humana Institute here.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Lash?
Hi, I'm Larry Lash. I'm a professor in the Department of Pharmacology at Wayne State University in Detroit. And let's see. So my expertise, I guess, work primarily on the kidneys, a little on liver, looking at mechanisms of cell injury in vitro models, drug metabolism, transport, oxidative stress, things like that. And I've done some work on some heavy metals, like mostly mercury and a bit of cadmium as well.
Okay, Dr. Post?
Hi, I'm Gloria Post. I'm a toxicologist with the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. I've been with the department for 37 years. I work on human health risk assessment and development of toxicity factors and environmental criteria for a wide variety of environmental contaminants of concern in New Jersey. I'm also a member of the New Jersey Drinking Water Quality Institute, which is an advisory body that recommends drinking water standards to the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. Thank you.
Okay. Dr. Rusin?
I'm a professor of physiology and pharmacology department in Texas A&M University School of Veterinary Medicine and Biomedical Sciences. I also direct our toxicology training program, which is focused on regulatory science, environmental health and toxicology, and also Superfund Research Center that is focused on disaster research response. I'm a toxicologist by training and with a broad expertise in a lot of different models, population-based models for testing toxicity, and also a lot of in vitro models and key characteristics in general mechanistic toxicology.
Okay, thanks. Dr. Weingarten?
Hi, my name is Edwin van Weingarten. I'm professor of public health sciences at the University of Rochester, also part of the Environmental Health Sciences Center there. I'm an environmental epidemiologist, and my primary area of expertise is metal toxicology / epidemiology with a focus on neurotoxicology, but also cancer.
Okay, Dr. Wise?
I'm John Wise. I'm a professor of pharmacology and toxicology at the University of Louisville. My expertise is in genetic toxicology, chemical carcinogenesis. I've worked on a lot of metals, but I've worked a lot on chromium over the past, say, 25, 30 years.
Okay, and Dr. Zitkovich?
Hello, I'm professor at Brown University in Department of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine. My area of expertise are metal carcinogenesis and genetic toxicology.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I think I got everyone because Dr. Pullenfednick isn't on the call today. I'll go through the agenda very quickly, and then we'll start off with the actual meeting itself. We've had the introductions, and this will be followed by some opening remarks from Dr. Thayer at EPA. And then Dr. Gibbons will lead an overview of the Chromium document itself and how the EPA went about putting it together. We'll have some time for some clarifying questions, and this is just for the panel to ask questions to clarify specific issues, but not actually to review the document. We'll hold that off till our face-to-face. Then after the break, there'll be public comments. There are 7 people who have signed up for public comments. And then we'll review the charge questions. Dr. Gibbons from EPA will go through the charge questions for us, and we'll have a chance to ask any clarifying questions that we might have. And then I'll go over the next steps between what we expect to happen between now and the face-to-face meeting. And then we'll adjourn. And with that, I think we'll move on to opening remarks from the EPA and Dr. Thayer.
Dr. Morris, just one edit to your comments.
Yep.
It will be Dr. Thayer that will go over the charge questions for us rather than Dr. Gibbons later on in the agenda.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so I guess the slides will be shared pretty soon. Yeah, okay, here we go. Well, first, it's great to be here, seeing some familiar faces, some new faces. We're very pleased, obviously, to kick off this first public engagement on the external peer review of the draft hexavalent chromium iris assessment. I need to also amplify my appreciation to the panel members. I mean, I know this is sort of no small feat to engage in one of these kind of reviews, and clearly, having this external review is a critical part of the IRIS process. I also want to extend thanks to the SAB staff, to the ORD staff for developing the assessment and sort of shepherding it through the process to get to this point. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide just probably most everybody on this call is aware of the IRIS program, but I'm going to sort of provide a short overview of the assessment. And then the bulk of the EPA time will be presentations by Doctors Catherine Gibbon and Alan Sasso, who are co-chemical managers for the assessment, and they'll walk you through the assessment. Next slide, please. So the Integrated Risk Information System, or IRIS, is actually a database of health effect information on hundreds of environmental pollutants. The IRIS assessments contribute to decisions across EPA and by other health agencies by providing toxicity values for cancer and non-cancer health effects. It's important to emphasize that IRIS assessments have no direct regulatory impact until they're combined with information about exposure, cost of cleanup, available technology, or other regulatory options that are the purview of EPA programs and regions or consumers of IRIS assessments outside of the EPA. And then what you see here is also just a schematic, the landing page of the IRIS website, where you can find more information about the program. And there's some links that if you're not already connected in terms of getting updates, then you can access those links. Next slide. So one of the most common questions we get are the status of different assessments. And so 3 times a year, we release the IRIS program Outlook. It will be updated this month. But what it does is it presents a snapshot of IRIS assessments and assessment related materials. And by that, I mean things from protocols or assessment plans. If there's manuscripts that are associated with an IRIS assessment, these are also posted here. And so it has timeframes, either sort of, in this case, if there's an activity, it'll provide access to the activity as well as project timeframes for the next public release. You can see that when the timeframe, the next step is closer, we try to project not just the fiscal year, but the quarter of the fiscal year. And then for timeframes that are more downstream, then it's typically expressed at the fiscal year level. Next slide. So again, IRIS assessments contribute to agency decisions by providing information that helps support health-based national standards, cleanup levels at local sites, advisory levels, can provide ranking for chemicals, for example, related to relative toxicity, provides general information to the public, and can help inform cost-benefit analysis. And on the right, you see a variety of the federal laws within EPA that IRIS assessments can help support, as well as broadly contributing to agency and strategic goals, regions and states, and then children's health and environmental justice as sort of broad themes or type of support. Next slide. So we've kind of already touched on this, but so when we're being precise, we refer to IRIS assessments as being chemical assessments, not risk assessments, because they really focus on the hazard characterization, a qualitative description of the hazard, as well as quantitative in terms of the concentrations or doses associated with the effect induction. So this would reflect the IRIS purview would be those first 2 green boxes, hazard ID and dose response assessment. Other parts of the full risk assessment process, exposure assessment, risk characterization, where you integrate what you know about hazard with exposure, and risk management are outside the domain of the IRIS program. Next slide. EPA takes scientific integrity very, very importantly, and the IRIS program, our goal is to produce state-of-the-science assessments that are objective, transparent, and rigorous for use in science-based decision-making, including, as you're aware, including some very high-profile chemicals. Recently, sort of related to this point, IRIS assessments use systematic review as a vehicle to be transparent and rigorous in its methods. In December of 22, very recently, we published the IRIS handbook that outlines our systematic review and dose response methods. And so those are brought to bear on Chromium and other assessments. In addition, the IRIS program follows a structured and transparent process to develop these assessments. And those processes are done in accordance with EPA's scientific integrity policy, the peer review handbook, and the IRIS 7-step process, which I'll outline on the next slide. So here's the IRIS 7-step process. We're now on step 4. So you can see step 1, scoping and problem formulation and draft development. That's, as you can imagine, that's typically the longest stage of the assessment development process. Recently, with recent assessments, you might find protocol release as being part of step 1. For more new assessments, as in 2018 and beyond, we'll also release an assessment plan that has a lot of the scoping and the problem formulation. So that's all part of step 1. And then after you have a draft developed, clearly it goes through internal review within Office of Research and Development, and then it launches to agency review, followed by an interagency science consultation. And then what we do is we revise the document based on what we've heard from steps 2 and 3, and then we release a public draft for public comment. And that's what's happened so far. And then today we have now, again, sort of the first public meeting of the external peer review. Following this, we'll clearly revise the assessment based on the feedback that we get from the external peer review. And then there will be another round of checking in with agency reviewers and then interagency science discussion prior to posting the final assessment. So at this point, this is sort of where we pass the baton. This is an overview of the IRIS process. And I believe the next slide passes the baton to Catherine.
Actually, I'll take it from here. Good afternoon. Can you guys hear me? Good. So good afternoon. My name is Dr. Alan Sasso. I'm the co-chemical manager of the Hexavalent Chromium assessment. And today I'm going to begin today's talk by discussing just some of the background information. Next slide, please. Listed here are just some of the available assessment materials, notably the toxicological review and supporting documentation, the systematic review protocol, the IRIS handbook, and public comments. Next slide, please. Next slide. So chromium-6 compounds, chromium compounds originate from both natural and man-made sources. Chromium exists primarily in the hexavalent and trivalent states. Chrome-3 compounds are not generally considered toxic, and they are out of scope of the assessment. Industrial uses for Chrome-6 include corrosion inhibition, pigment manufacturing, metal finishing or chrome plating, and wood preservation. Next slide, please. Discontinued uses continue to present issues at EPA Superfund sites. These include leather tanning or corrosion inhibition within water-cooled systems. Chrome-6 is also a waste product of industrial and energy processes. Those include stainless steel production and electric utilities. EPA data indicate widespread Chrome-6 occurrence in U.S. drinking water supplies. There is currently no nationwide maximum contaminant level for hexavalent chromium. The current MCL is for total chromium, and that's set at 100 parts per billion, or a microgram per liter. Airborne sources of Chrome-6, which is classified as a hazardous air pollutant, are typically man-made from chrome platers, stainless steel producers, chrome ore refineries, fossil fuel production, combustion, and glass producers. And Chrome-6 emissions along fence-line communities are an environmental justice concern, as noted by some of these examples below, which show that chromium emissions along, it's not too uncommon for chromium facilities to coexist near residential homes. Next slide, please. I think Catherine takes over from here.
Yeah, thanks. So just a brief review of the history of the hexavalent chromium assessment. The IRIS assessment currently posted to the IRIS database was conducted in 1998. Where they were able at the time to derive inhalation unit risk as well as non-cancer toxicity reference values. But at that time, there were no data indicating that cancer could be caused by ingestion of hexavalent chromium. And that all changed in 2008 when the National Toxicology Program released the results of its 2-year drinking water study, finding clear evidence of carcinogenic activity in male and female mice and rats. So at that time, an updated IRIS assessment focusing on oral exposures was quickly drafted to incorporate these findings. But peer review in 2011 recommended that EPA wait for new studies that were underway at the time that might provide more information regarding the pharmacokinetics as well as mode of action for cancer of hexavalent chromium. So since then, we've held a workshop focusing on the pharmacokinetics in the GI tract following ingestion, as well as 2 sets of preliminary materials in 2014 that was part of one of our first of many iterations of implementing systematic review procedures for hexavalent chromium assessments. And so given our goal of consistently updating and improving our systematic review procedures, this was really the assessment was essentially restarted in 2017 to fully implement the most updated procedures. And we released a protocol reflecting this in 2019 and had another public science meeting at that time. And that brings us to where we are today. And I want to emphasize that the public comment draft that's been released for this external peer review does take into account the agency and interagency review comments that were made during those review periods last year. Next slide. Okay, so moving methods. As I said, IRIS assessments now implement systematic review procedures as described in the IRIS handbook. These are also described specific for Chromium in the protocol, which is Appendix A of the tox review, as well as Chapter 2. This includes specific aims that identify the health effects included for hazard ID and dose response. And these were based on scoping and problem formulation efforts that involve stakeholder input, as well as reviews of existing assessments and reviews. It identifies the PICO criteria, or populations, exposures, comparators, and outcomes that will help identify the primary evidence that will address these specific aims. Next slide. So for hexavalent chromium, it was determined that the hazard ID was not going to be revisited for lung cancer and nasal effects. These effects are very well characterized. So instead, we adopted classifications for hazard ID and moved on and focused on looking at evidence that could help improve the quantitative dose response analyses, as well as any evidence that would be directly relevant to cancer mode of action. So for hazard ID and dose response, again, lung was dose response only, but we also included cancer of the lung and GI tract. Other cancer types were of course considered, but there were no other cancer data in studies that met PICO criteria outside of the lung or GI tract. For non-cancer effects, we included lower respiratory tract effects, GI tract effects, liver, hematological, immunological, male and female reproductive, and developmental. But dermal effects, as well as kidney effects and neurotoxicity, were considered to be out of scope for this assessment. Next slide. So the PICO criteria are used to screen the literature and identify studies that will, again, primarily inform hazard ID and dose response. And these studies move directly to study evaluation and data extraction. All other studies that are considered to be of high importance to the assessment, but not clearly directly relevant to hazard ID and dose response, are categorized as potentially relevant supplemental material. And we have methods for prioritizing these studies that can also be subjected to study evaluation based on the potential impact to assessment conclusions. Next slide. So as I said, for the study evaluations conducted to determine risk of bias, sensitivity, and reporting for studies included in the PICO criteria. These are assessed using domain-based criteria that were originally established for human studies and have been adopted for animal studies. These implement criteria that are consistent, and all of these full evaluations can be found in HAWK. One quick, clarification for risk of bias, because we divide both risk of bias and sensitivity considerations, a study can be found to be of low risk of bias, but could also be found to be of low sensitivity for informing the hazard that's being assessed. Next slide. So briefly, this is a heat map showing the individual domains and overall conclusions for study evaluations that can be viewed in HAWK, and some of these are also in the assessment. Next slide. And if you click on each one of these studies, you can see the study confidence and domain rating decisions and rationales by each outcome for all evaluated studies. Next slide. As well as data that have been extracted from studies can be visualized in HAWK as well. Next slide. So the handbook also describes the framework that we use for the within-stream evidence syntheses of animal and human evidence, as well as mechanistic evidence and overall integration, which was modeled on the cancer guidelines to provide a similar weight of evidence framework for non-cancer health effects. And these can be found, these are both summarized in text as well as in evidence profile tables available for each health effect. Next slide.
Hi, so I'll take over from here. So we'll now briefly discuss, some of the key assessment issues. So Chromium 6 is known to reduce the trivalent chromium in biological fluids. Chromium 3 is poorly absorbed by cells and has limited toxicity. And again, as I noted earlier, it's out of scope of the assessment. Humans detoxify Chromium 6 more efficiently than rodents, particularly in the stomach lumen, due to lower gastric pH. The human stomach pH is usually around below 2, whereas rodents have a stomach pH of around 4. Pharmacokinetics were considered at every step of the assessment: hazard identification, mode of action, dose response, uncertainty, and susceptibility. Next slide. Imagine briefly that this is the human or animal body. I'm an engineer, so that's how I draw it. One major issue that we have is, or question is, can unreduced Chromium 6 reach target tissues in rodents and humans at levels high enough to induce some or all modes of action? Next slide. So upon ingestion, Chromium 6 mixes with saliva and briefly contacts the oral epithelium before quickly passing through the esophagus into the stomach. Once in the stomach, which has an acidic environment, Chromium 6 mixes with gastric juices and contents, and it's believed a large percentage of hexavalent chromium will reduce to the less toxic trivalent form. Now, the stomach may hold the contents for a given amount of time, and some contact with the stomach epithelium is possible. Now, after emptying to the small intestine, any remaining Chromium 6 that wasn't reduced will probably reduce at a slower rate because the small intestine has a higher pH. And it's believed that this is where most of the systemic absorption will occur. And this is also known for, essential metals and everything. And this is where the small intestine is where the absorption of nutrients occurs. So any leftover Chromium 6 in the small intestine will flow through the portal blood and into the liver. And this is known as the first pass effect, where even more reduction occurs. And in the blood, Chromium 6 is rapidly absorbed by red blood cells, which reduce it to Chromium 3. And the chromium that gets reduced in red blood cells remains trapped inside the cell for the lifetime of the red blood cell. So in general, following oral exposure, the GI and liver are expected to get the highest tissue doses. Other sites distal to the GI and liver are not expected to have as strong of dose response. So when looking at the tox data or mode of action data, it's not surprising that we get weaker signals in sites that are outside the GI when trying to look at other sites. Next slide. Now, following inhalation, the main target tissue becomes the lung, and uptake to the systemic circulation also occurs. There could be some mucus clearing back to the GI, but it's really expected that the GI and liver would not experience as strong a dose response as you get from oral exposure. We took these facts into consideration when making determinations on the overall evidence and mode of action, and we decided not to perform any root-to-root extrapolation of effects because of the very, very different, the different pathways that Chromium 6 gets into the body. There's just very, very different, effects. We don't expect there to be many GI effects following inhalation. We don't expect there to be respiratory effects following oral absorption. Next slide. And following injections, we get high systemic tissues of high systemic exposure to systemic tissues. These typically don't occur following oral inhalation because there's less barriers, there's less pathways for Chromium 6 to detoxify. But But, on the other hand, there's no direct exposure to those apical cells in the GI or respiratory tract lumen following intravenous or IP injection. Next slide. Again, following oral ingestion, it's believed that there is a high concentration of Chrome-6 in the oral cavity, although it's brief, and possibly a gradient of Chrome-6 concentration across the tissue depth. Next slide. The Chrome-6 gradient dissipates as you travel down the GI. Most of the GI effects were seen in the duodenum. Depending on the localized environment and the tissue subtype, there are different tissue morphologies and different locations of the different types of cells. Next slide. I think this is the slide.
Yeah, thanks. So all health effects included in the assessment included synthesis of the relevant mechanistic evidence. We evaluated during scoping and problem formulation existing cancer mode of action analyses for hexavalent chromium and identified two primary modes of action that had been covered many times by many groups. These would be the mutagenic mode of action and a cytotoxicity and regenerative hyperplasia mode of action. So I think, it's important to recognize that these, when evidence is taken at face value, these mode of action analyses can differ quite substantially. And here are two examples of mode of action analyses using the same framework in the cancer guidelines, using pretty much the same evidence and coming to different conclusions. One, that it's a mutagenic mode of action, the other cytotoxicity and regenerative proliferation. So it was hoped by implementing new systematic review procedures and prioritizing the evidence that would be the most impactful to making decisions regarding mode of action, that we could take these through a deeper level of study evaluation, and contribute to the weight of evidence for helping make a decision about whether mutagenicity could be occurring independently of cytotoxicity, or if it's an effect that is not relevant until after cytotoxicity has been initiated. Next slide. Oh, and I should say, I'm going to talk about that more later in the talk. Move to Alan.
Okay, so I'm going to walk through some of the non-cancer and some of the dose response conclusions. So for the hazards listed here, respiratory, GI, and hepatic, EPA determined that evidence indicates that Chrome-6 is likely to cause these toxicities in humans. These determinations were primarily based on animal and mechanistic evidence. Next slide. For developmental effects, EPA also concluded that effects were likely, again, based primarily on animal and mechanistic evidence. There was a lot of mechanistic evidence for oxidative stress and also in other pathways that can disrupt, various different systems in vivo. For hematological and immune effects, the animal data were generally not as convincing. For hematological effects, there was a very strong dose response, but this only occurred at short exposures, so that brought into question some of the biological relevance at chronic exposures, because at 12 months, the effects seen in multiple complete blood count markers were ameliorated at 12 months. For immune, there were many unexplained inconsistencies. So for those health effects, the judgment was evidence suggests. The other effects I described earlier, the developmental GI liver, those were evidence indicates. Next slide. This is also the case for male reproductive effects, where there was only slight animal and human evidence. So that judgment was evidence suggests that category. For female reproductive effects, the judgment was that evidence was inadequate to make a determination. And this is because of just indeterminate evidence in both animal and human data. Next slide. 2 health effects were advanced for consideration for the RFC. And as I said earlier, we did not consider root-to-root extrapolation because of the issues, the very root-specific issues we were seeing in the data and just knowing the mechanisms involved. The 2 health effects were lower respiratory effects, and that was based on animal data, and effects in the nasal cavity based on human occupational data. Next slide. So for the RFC, we went with nasal effects. The principal study was the Baltimore cohort, an occupational study in chromate production workers with a very large sample size. The critical effect was ulceration of the nasal septum, which had high incidence and an early onset time. The RFC, adjusted for continuous lifetime exposure and application of the uncertainty factors, was 1 × 10⁻⁵ milligram per meter cubed. And this was slightly higher than one of the RFCs derived in 1998 for nasal effects. The RFC was medium confidence. While there was high confidence in the hazard and the principal study, there was reduced confidence due to uncertainty in determining the point of departure. All nasal studies that were available showed high incidence of effects at lowest concentrations, so there was uncertainty in the dose response. Next slide, please. So for the RFD, there were many different candidate health effects in different systems that were advanced forward. Briefly, there was liver inflammation, decreased offspring growth, decreased hemoglobin, and also other complete blood cell count changes, hyperplasia in the small intestine. We used a gastric pharmacokinetic model to account for interspecies differences in gastric pH, volume, emptying, and reducing capacity. We focused only on the stomach for PK modeling because that's where most of the reduction is believed to happen, and it's likely that that's the biggest source of the interspecies and interindividual variability. Given the uncertainties in the rest of the GI tract and system, we did not believe a full body PBK model was necessary. So any unreduced Chrome-6 exiting the stomach was considered to be the maximum possible amount available for uptake to the GI. From there, we applied a body weight 3/4 scaling to the unreduced dose, and we believe this to be a balance between what we know about stomach reduction, which is, humans are probably less susceptible than rodents and more efficient at reducing Chrome-6. And we were balancing that with the uncertainties surrounding the localized systemic target tissue doses and systemic doses, which were very, very difficult to accurately predict. Next slide. So the RFD was based on gastrointestinal tract effects. The principal study was the NTP 2-year drinking water bioassay. The critical effect was diffuse epithelial hyperplasia in female mice. RFD was 9 × 10⁻⁴ milligram per kilogram per day, which is about 30 times lower than the RFD posted in the 1990 IRIS assessment. There was high confidence based on the hazard evidence and strong dose response seen in multiple studies, and there was also supporting data in male mice. Some of the charge questions, we'll get into this because there's some uncertainty in trying to perform the dose response modeling and low AL, no AL extrapolation. So we'll probably get to that later when we discuss the charge questions. Next slide.
Yeah, thanks. So moving to cancer mode of action, next slide. Yeah, thanks. The majority of evidence, mechanistic evidence relevant to the cancer mode of action, systematically identified and organized using the key characteristics of carcinogens. This organization then provided a basis for identifying key events thought to be involved in the carcinogenic pathways of hexavalent chromium, which includes the histopathology and tumor evidence in animals, both lung tumors via inhalation, and tumors of the small intestine in mice, and oral cavity tumors in rats that are exposed via ingestion. So when paired with hallmarks of cancer, we've attempted to provide a visualization of the pathways proposed to be involved in hexavalent chromium-induced carcinogenesis. A few of these, or many actually, these prospective key events are well established for hexavalent chromium. And prior to planning the mode of action analysis, there were a few key conclusions that we could make that would help with our prioritization and where to focus for this analysis. Next slide, please. So first, we know that hexavalent chromium is rapidly taken up by cells unless first reduced to trivalent chromium extracellularly, and that this intracellular reduction of chromium results in reactive intermediates and trivalent chromium, which is directly DNA reactive and forms chromium DNA adducts. So this results then in consistent evidence of genotoxicity when a direct method of hexavalent chromium exposure is used. So we see this in most in vitro test systems test positive for genotoxicity unless higher levels of reductants are present, as well as studies that employ intraperitoneal injections in animals. We also know that hexavalent chromium induces a host of other genotoxic effects, both via oxidative stress and formation of oxidative DNA lesions, which occurs via reactive intermediates during intracellular reduction of hexavalent chromium, as well as inhibition of DNA repair that involves both direct interactions of chromium and epigenetic modifications of DNA repair enzymes. These can lead to aneuploidy genomic instability, and microsatellite instability has also been observed in human studies. Next slide. So we also know that we've established the non-cancer hazards of hexavalent chromium. The available evidence does support a pathway of tissue injury induced by cytotoxicity in the lung and GI tract that may lead to necrosis and regenerative proliferation. In fact, the hyperplastic lesions in the female mouse small intestine provided the basis for the RFD and are considered to be pre-neoplastic. So what don't we know about mode of action then to look and toggle between these two potential modes of action, which are not mutually exclusive, mutagenicity and cytotoxicity and regenerative proliferation? So in humans, it's important to establish or determine whether ingested or inhaled hexavalent chromium can even reach the tumor used prior to being reduced. And this is an important question because, as Alan reviewed earlier, humans have a much higher reductive capacity for ingested hexavalent chromium. And secondly, can mutagenicity result directly from this exposure, or is it only secondary to toxicity? So the primary goal then is to really focus on in vivo studies with mutagenic, observing mutagenicity that would take into account these pharmacokinetic considerations, and also take into account a lot of new studies that have come out since the last peer review. Next slide. So looking at the first question, can ingested or inhaled hexavalent chromium reach target tissues prior to reduction? And the answer is yes. So we know that, in the lung, not only is there a more direct application, but also when inhaled, but there's low acid there for reduction, as well as limited defenses and a higher surface area. And the GI tract, based on PK modeling, as well as in vivo and even in vitro data that have indicated that hexavalent chromium can expose the GI tract in humans following ingestion. So then focusing on the second question, can mutagenicity result from this exposure? In order to answer this, we needed to review the evidence and prioritize to systematically evaluate the in vivo studies of mutagenicity. And as I said earlier, all studies meeting PICO criteria immediately go into study evaluation, but we have a prioritization of other types of supplemental evidence based on how impactful they'll be for mode of action decisions. So it was determined that this included studies of humans or animals exposed via ingestion or inhalation, and included outcomes that observed mutation. So that would be studies of gene mutations, chromosomal aberrations, and micronuclei, which in combination are complementary because chromosomal aberrations, detect classigenicity, and micronuclei can detect both that and aneuploidy. Gene mutations are smaller, chromosomal aberrations and micronuclei usually slightly larger events. Next slide. So we identified in humans 23 cross-sectional occupational studies. The exposure was inferred based on occupation, in many cases confirmed with chromium biomarkers or measured concentrations. We did not identify any oral exposure studies looking at these endpoints, and no gene mutation studies in pre-neoplastic tissues. But looking at these across, we identified 16 micronucleus studies and 10 chromosomal aberration studies. Most of these were determined to be low confidence. But looking at the data, particularly for the micronucleus data, when we separate these out, Most studies were positive, and our interpretations really focused on not only that consistency, but also finding positive results despite bias toward the null, which most of these low confidence studies had. It also is interesting when you break it down this way that, you know, the increase in micronuclei results could be a reflection of the aneuploidy that's thought to result from several pathways directly and indirectly affected by hexavalent chromium. Next slide. So we also identified 15 animal and Vivo studies and evaluated these using the animal study evaluation domains with assay-specific considerations. All of these studies were determined to be low confidence for a variety of reasons. You know, all of these studies were conducted with different goals in mind. And just to give some context for what, you know, the purposes for context for assessing mutagenic hazard in vivo, primarily or particularly for a substance that is known to be mutagenic in other test systems, the primary evidence we were looking for comes from studies that were adequately designed to be sensitive enough to detect an effect. And this is, you know, most in vivo genotoxicity studies are, you know, they use fewer animals, they're typically shorter in duration. And so generally higher dose ranges are used to increase the sensitivity as well as ensure that the test article reaches the target tissue. And certainly, you know, other types of testing can be completely valid. Other, you know, study designs can be scientifically justified. But unless we have this primary set of complementary genetic toxicology tests that use test methods that give us confidence in that the test article reached the target tissue and that the tests were conducted in a way that was proficient and with low risk of bias, then it's very difficult to interpret other kinds of test designs. So when looking then overall at studies looking at traditional genotoxicity tissues, so blood and bone marrow, most of these results were negative, but they also, none of them showed a reduction of you know, the proportion of immature among total erythrocytes in the bone marrow, which essentially indicates that there was no toxicity in when ingested in drinking water in these tissues. So I think, you know, that basically says that using these traditional tissues, blood and bone marrow, it just was not a good system for accurately measuring genotoxicity for hexavalent chromium, because it's probably likely that uptake in blood is sufficiently quick that concentrations of hexavalent chromium probably can't reach these tissues. Studies or reach these tissues in sufficient amounts to be sensitive enough to detect an effect. But studies in the GI tract or lung target tissues are a much better model for testing hexavalent chromium-induced genotoxicity. But these are not standard. And so typically, you know, when you're using a non-traditional tissue, it's important for labs conducting these studies to establish historical background data and proficiency in these tests. And if this hasn't been done, it's even more essential to use concurrent positive controls that work, dose up to the maximum tolerated dose, and establish a background frequency of a minimal amount. And these are generally, you know, these are all based on OECD guidance where available or other publications as indicated. And all of these evaluations are available in HAWK. But, you know, it's understandable that, you know, most of these studies were negative looking in tumor target tissues. There were a few exceptions, but generally they were mostly negative. And it's understandable that these studies were also primarily, most of these designed to only look at the doses that found toxicity and hyperplasia in tumors in the NTP bioassay. But, you know, without establishing the basic criteria that I went through of including concurrent positive controls, doses up to the maximum tolerated dose, or establishing a background frequency, or generally showing proficiency, it's very difficult to have high confidence in null results. Next slide, please. So to summarize, for the cancer mode of action, you know, again, what we already know is that hexavalent chromium, you know, uptake and reduction leads to DNA damage. We have evidence in humans that were exposed showing increased micronuclei, and also to a lesser degree, but still significantly, chromosomal aberrations, both in peripheral blood and exfoliated nasal and buccal cells in these workers. We've also established that cytotoxicity and cell proliferative effects are contributing to carcinogenic effects. But the overall judgment was that given what we know about the mutagenicity of hexavalent chromium, we just didn't have high enough confidence in the null findings in the in vivo animal studies to be able to provide an informative comparison of dose and temporal concordance between a mutagenic mode of action and a cytotoxicity and cell proliferative mode of action as the cancer guidelines would dictate. And it's very likely that both of these are involved in carcinogenesis induced by hexavalent chromium. But the overall conclusion was that a mutagenic mode of action for cancer induced by inhaled or ingested hexavalent chromium cannot be ruled out and is biologically plausible and relevant to humans. And there's one more factor regarding human susceptibility to take into account for mode of action that Alan will review next. Next slide, please.
Hi, I just want to just give a few notes on susceptibility. So a fraction of the population may be at increased risk due to high gastric pH. High pH or low reducing capacity will inhibit the ability to detoxify ingested hexavalent chromium. Such populations we noted in the assessment include children, infants and the elderly, people with underlying gastric conditions that cause high pH, and individuals taking medications to lower stomach acid. The PK modeling in our assessment is only applicable to healthy adults with normal gastric conditions, and it wasn't possible to quantify all variabilities and uncertainties regarding the human gastrointestinal tract. I mean, there's just way too much variability in the population to be able to capture everything quantitatively. But that said, we did apply multiple health protective assumptions throughout development of the assessment and the numbers, and we closely followed our cancer and dose response guidelines, and we are confident that the values derived in the assessment are health protective for most of the population. Next slide. Next slide, dude. So the conclusions, again, EPA reaffirmed that Chrome-6 is a human carcinogen by inhalation, lung cancer. EPA concluded that there was a mutagenic mode of action for all routes of exposure, and so the age-dependent adjustment factors, or ADAFs, were applied. The lifetime inhalation unit risk with the ADAF was 2 per microgram per meter cubed, and this was based on hexavalent chromium data. Once finalized, this would replace the 1998 IUR of 1.2, which was based on total chromium data, and that introduced a lot of uncertainty in that number. So there were no ADAFs under the old guidance, and if you take away the ADAF from the current Tract IUR, they're actually about the same. So there's not too much different, at least without the ADAF. EPA determined that Chrome-6 is likely carcinogenic to the GI tract following oral ingestion. This is based on robust animal evidence and the mechanistic information Dr. Gibbons presented. The lifetime oral slope factor with the ADAF is 0.5 per milligram per kilogram per day. Next slide. The principal study for the oral slope factor was the NTP two-year drinking water bioassay. It had a very large sample size and extremely well-defined dose response data. The critical effect was tumors in the small intestine of mice. We acknowledge the uncertainties that we mentioned before, and those relate to pharmacokinetic modeling uncertainties and susceptible populations. Next slide. So these are the dose response data on plotted against concentration. Again, it's indisputable that as you increase drinking water concentration, you increase tumor incidence, even beginning at the lowest concentration of 5 parts per million. The current MCL is 50 times lower than this concentration. Next slide. On the basis of dose, these are the small intestinal tumor data in mice. Because of the increasing trend and the historical rarity of these tumors, we don't discount the small increases at low doses simply because they're not significant if doing a pairwise comparison. This chart shows incidence based on tumor-bearing animals. What it doesn't capture is the fact that some animals had multiple tumors in the small intestine, and this is also a very rare occurrence. Next slide. For oral tumors, the dose response wasn't as strong, but there was still a trend, and these tumors are even more rare than those seen in mice. The oral tumors were noted by NTP as being very aggressive in the study and spreading to other areas, including the brain. We didn't apply any gastric reduction models to the oral tumor data when we developed candidate slope factors, because the epithelial exposure kind of occurs directly in the oral cavity prior to any significant Chrome-6 reduction in the stomach. Next slide. So for the inhalation unit risk, the principal study was the Baltimore cohort, which explored a large population of chromate production workers. The study reported 217 deaths from lung cancer compared to 133 expected deaths. It had over 70,000 measurements of speciated Chrome-6 concentrations in air over 25 years. The linear low, again, as I said earlier, the linear low dose IUR with the ADAF was 2 per microgram per meter cubed. We considered a number of possible uncertainties, and given the large sample sizes and the strength of the study data, many of those uncertainties were considered to be low. For example, confounding by smoking was low due to extensive data on smoking rates, and there were no mesotheliomas, so confounding by asbestos was considered low. Because the ADAF was triggered by the mutagenic mode of action, this did introduce some small uncertainty because the population studied was working adults, and there's uncertainty when extrapolating that to young children. Next slide. I think Kevin takes the first path.
Yeah. So just briefly, there are some updated approaches that were used in this tox review that have limited or no implementation in previous assessments. So again, we implemented systematic review procedures for the identification, evaluation, synthesis, and of human, animal, and mechanistic evidence. We also were able to derive oral and inhalation reference values in cancer slope factors that are specific to hexavalent chromium rather than total chromium. A meta-analysis was also conducted to estimate the GI cancer risk in occupationally exposed populations. That did not end up being a significant factor in determining, because there was a pretty low, a pretty slight risk that was indicated, but this is fully, this was a large undertaking, and the most of the methods and results are described in the appendix. We also evaluated occupational and animal exposures for mutation endpoints that, for in these in vivo studies. That was also a new thing for us, as well as organizing the mechanistic evidence using the 10 key characteristics, which allowed us to identify key events for carcinogenesis.
So I'll jump in from this one last bullet. So again, while we did apply a PK model to account for interspecies differences and to some extent inter-individual variability, there were still, significant uncertainties in modeling both humans and animals, and this is discussed in detail in the assessment. So if we were to forego all PK modeling together because of high uncertainties and just apply by-weight three-quarters scaling guidance, this essentially would assume that humans are as inefficient at reducing Chrome-6 as rodents. And if you look at it that way, that might be one way to determine an upper bound on risk for sensitive groups without unnecessarily adding on more uncertainty factors. So that's also discussed in the assessment as one sort of upper bound you could provide on the assessment by just approaching the problem with defaults. So next slide. I think we're done here. These are all the contributors to the assessment.
Yeah, so thanks everyone, and that concludes our talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for that comprehensive talk. We have some time for questions. If members of the panel have any clarifying questions, I think we'll just let people shout out, unless there are a lot of them. Or actually, I see some hands up, so we'll do that. Dr. Rusin?
Yes, thank you. I was wondering if you can go to the timeline slide in the presentation. I have a question on that.
Would that be slide 13? The history slide?
Yes.
Okay. You can go ahead.
Actually, I need to see it to ask.
Okay. Slide 13. Yeah.
So thank you. So I'm Ivan Rusin, member of the panel from Texas A&M University, for those of you listening on the phone. So this history in brief indicates that the protocol was drafted and released in 2019. Can you tell me more about, when you actually have done all the searches and actually, put all this evidence together, and how does it relate to kind of pre-final draft of the handbook that was, in review by the National Academies and Interagency? So it's not clear from this table as to whether that was actually like 2020, 2021, like in 1 year you did all the systematic reviews, or you've done those previously and then you've just kind of updated that. So if you can elaborate on the timing of what was happening, because it seems to be quite compressed from 2019 release of the protocol to the release of the assessment.
Yeah, thanks, Yvonne. I think there is a lot more, obviously a lot more history here than we wanted to get into, but I think to a certain extent, certainly a lot of these assessments that were already ongoing when we implemented, multiple iterations of systematic review procedures. It was a bit of a Frankenstein at first, and we did have an existing, we used the preliminary materials that were released in 2014. And the study identification that was already conducted there, and then updated that for the new version in 2017. And I think too, it's also important to stress that the way that we conduct our literature searches is that we use a broad literature search that searches for everything relevant to hexavalent chromium, generally taking out things that are obviously irrelevant, like engineering studies, but then we then go through those and screen through. So we don't use individual search strings looking for each specific health effect or each mechanistic event. We look at the broad literature search. And so typically our updates involve, going through quite a lot of literature, but we have updated multiple times. But yeah, I think, probably, sorry, the short answer to your question is the 2019 protocol. It did start, it was, that literature search was building off what we started in the 2014 preliminary packages.
And is somewhere in the assessment, there's, in one of the appendices, there is an indication as to, here was the evidence was in 2014, and then, an update search was done in this period of time, and this is new literature, or there's no such information?
No, I don't think we did that. And I think it was determined, maybe I shouldn't let someone else speak for this, but I don't think we felt like that was going to, I don't think it occurred to me that that would be particularly informative, especially because you can look at the 2014 assessment or the preliminary materials and see what was identified then. I think generally everything that was included after that is simply, updated to newer literature. Probably, also taking into account the PICO criteria that were used in 2017. There may have been fewer studies that were scoped out, but yeah, I don't think we don't go through that to that level of detail.
Okay, Dr. Lash?
Yeah, I just had a question about, I know in the document, you spend a lot of time talking about evaluating studies as high, medium, or low confidence. And then there are also studies that are rated as, I think uninformative is the term that was used. And I'd have to look at my notes to follow, to find exactly, there were a couple of examples where those actually studies were used in the in evaluations and considerations. And I guess I was wondering how that is justified or why that's done. Is it just because it's the only thing available, or and it elicits significant, variability, but or lack of confidence, but it's still the only thing available? I was just wondering about that point.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I'll let Chris handle this. This is something that we've dealt with a lot. So it's a good question. Chris, go ahead.
Sorry, I raised my hand to answer Yvonne's question. Sorry, catch me up, and I'm happy
sorry.
to. That's okay.
Well, you can do that too if you want.
Okay, just remind me. Sorry, because I was thinking about the response to Yvonne. Remind me of the question here. Sorry.
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just saying that I was just wondering about the classification of of studies with high, low, medium, high, medium, and low confidence. But there are also some studies that were described as uninformative, but yet there were a couple of cases, and the limitations in those studies were explained. But in some cases, they were still actually used to make conclusions. And I was wondering how that's kind of justified, or what the reasoning was for that.
For the uninformative.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So let me go with that first, and then let me sort of back up to elaborate on Yvonne's question.
Sure.
So I will say, during this period, in terms of thinking about the handbook and the methods, what we do with the uninformative studies in particular has been one that we've kind of wrestled with. So in practice, a study can be considered uninformative, which means there's either a thing or a collection of things that really sort of makes us have great pause in considering it all, like deal breakers that you wouldn't sort of even want to include in a meta-analysis. So something like a small sample size would not be a deal breaker, but really things that are more foundational. And so it's not is there a critical deficiency in one domain necessarily? It can be that, but it can also be a collection. Typically, we don't use those studies for hazard or dose response. That's where we've kind of settled. I will let the Chromium team elaborate more specifically on the exact examples that might be brought up in the Chromium assessment. If they are, it's more supportive in hazard, but not something we would use for dose response. But what I want to emphasize is that, because this has been a sort of a point that we've had to clarify in the handbook, that it takes a lot to have a study be considered uninformative. And it's not just a deficiency in one domain. It's really thinking about the criticality of that deficiency. And then I don't know if we want to, again, I wanted to kind of elaborate a little bit more on what Yvonne raised, but I don't know if we want to close the thread in this question.
Yeah, I can just say really quickly. So uninformative studies were not considered for any hazard identification or dose response in the hexavalent chromium assessment. We do, at the outset of each health effects section, describe why the uninformative studies were found to be uninformative, and then usually state these studies will not be further discussed. They do sometimes show up in the summary tables, because sometimes, these uninformative, these are by outcome, not by study. So, sometimes that gets a little mixed up, but sometimes a study can report multiple outcomes and only one is uninformative. So in that case, it may appear that we've considered those studies, but actually we just haven't included the outcomes that were uninformative. And we would certainly like to clarify if that's not clear anywhere in the document. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. Beck-Barber, did you want to jump in right now?
I have a different question. So if people are still
Okay.
talking about that one,
Okay.
I'll hold off.
Chris?
Should I elaborate on Yvonne's question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
More on sort of the protocol. Right. So the idea is 2017 to 2018 is really when we kind of solidified this practice of having protocols released with assessments. And so then you had Chromium, which clearly was in progress before then. So at that time, in this case, we're talking about a protocol release in 2019. In that case, it was a little bit of a hybrid, kind of a catching up so that all of our assessments would have that same level of transparency, but also recapping some of the work that had already been done. And in particular, when you're talking about screening studies and identifying studies, that part of the process in terms of the considerations, the PICO criteria, that's been pretty stable for a while. That's been pretty stable. And then I think, Catherine, when you were sort of talking about documenting the lineage of the literature updates, probably in the appendix materials, there's indication of when certain searches were done and when updated.
Yeah, definitely that level, but not a clear description of these studies were identified in 2014, and these studies were, this is how that evidence base changed in 2019. That's not something we did.
Okay, Dr. Beck.
I have a question about the choice of the use of key characteristics. It's, it's clear that was an important part of the decision making. And given that there's been discussion regarding the predictive ability of the key characteristics, I was interested to know whether you discuss how dependent the conclusions are on the upfront decision to focus on the key characteristics.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Beck. I don't know how other groups use key characteristics of carcinogens, but the way IRIS uses it is to identify and organize evidence, and that's it. There's no decision making based on those characteristics. There's no framework there for making decisions. We take that information, it's convenient for organizing and summarizing, and in this case, it provided a great segue into selecting elements of the characteristics, be that into like that were the most likely key events. And so those key events do feed into the mode of action framework, but the key characteristics themselves were not used as a part of that. So all of the evidence for the key events that were identified are summarized in a couple different tables in the mode of action section. Sometimes these do happen to correspond to key characteristics, but we tried to indicate in that figure that I showed which have overlap, and then which are independent from that, and then which are actually more hallmarks of cancer, which is a different, focusing on the cancer itself rather than the carcinogenic properties of the chemical.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, does anyone else have Dr. Post?
I have a question about the ADAF factors, the age-dependent adjustment factors. And can you explain like what the criteria for as far as the level of how well established a mutagenic mode of action is to apply them? Because that's a separate question, obviously, than a threshold like cancer slope factor versus a non-threshold versus a threshold assumption. That's a totally separate question than applying the ADAFs, which is a separate step. So for the mode of action, like how well established does it have to be that it's a mutagenic mode of action? And also, if there's more than one mode of action, possibly, how does that work with the ADAFs, which is, as I said, separate than whether to use a slope factor or a threshold approach?
Yes, so I think the main if it's a mutagenic mode of action and there's no chemical specific data to inform differences between children and adults, it's assumed that there could be increased early life susceptibility. So I think I think once there is a mutagenic mode of action determined, then I think it just kind of defaults to is there chemical specific data for early life, and if not, then you apply the ADAF.
But so for chemicals with a cancer slope factor is used as a default because you don't know the mode of action, you don't apply them. But when there's evidence for mutagenic mode of action, you do apply them. Is that pretty much how correct?
I think that's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's right.
Thank you.
Okay, are there any other questions? Speak now. Not seeing any. So we're lucky to be ahead of schedule. So let's take a 20-minute break, because we have to make sure the outside public commenters are online when we get to that section of the meeting. So let's come back together at 1:45. Thank you, everybody.
For the public commenters that are listening in, please go ahead and log into the Zoom call so that when we return from the break, you can start presenting your comments. Thank you. Okay, Dr. Morris, we are ready to move forward.
Okay, thank you. So we're ready to move on to the public comments. And there's 7 speakers who are first come, first serve. And they should limit their comments to 3 minutes, and we'll have a chance for the members of the panel to ask any clarifying questions that they might have. So first up is Dr. Samuel Cohen. Dr. Cohen. There he is.
Yeah, my name is Sam Cohen, and I'm a professor in the Department of Pathology and Microbiology and at the Buffett Cancer Center. Can you hear me?
Yep, we hear you fine.
I'm getting an echo.
You might have.
I'm getting a duplicate.
You probably have the YouTube live stream on as well. So if you want to.
Let me see if I can get that off.
Yeah. Because we hear you fine. There was no echo on our side.
Okay, I'll try again. Can you?
We can hear you.
I'm getting a duplicate. Okay, I'll start again. My name is Sam Cohen. I'm a professor in the Department of Pathology and practicing in the Department of Pathology and Microbiology. I'm sorry, and microbiology at the University Medical Center. I'm a practicing surgical pathologist and have long been involved in chemical carcinogenesis research. I have not received funding for my Chromium review. I'm not able to turn off that YouTube. I'm not able to turn off the YouTube, so I'm getting a constant feedback. And
just close your link to the YouTube. Close it all together.
I'm not sure how to do that here.
There should be an X at the corner.
I'm having trouble doing that.
Okay, maybe we should move on to the next speaker, and we'll come back to you, Dr. Cohen, after you're able to turn off the YouTube.
Right. That sounds like a plan. So next is Dr. Chad Thompson. Dr. Thompson.
Hi, thank you. I'm Dr. Chad Thompson with Tox Strategies. My remarks today will highlight 3 critical issues with EPA's draft review, primarily pertaining to charge question 6, carcinogenicity hazard identification and toxicity value derivation. More detailed comments have been submitted to the EPA and SAB dockets. If you're following along with the slides I provided, starting with EPA's toxicity value for Chrome 6, the table on slide 1 lists several recently developed toxicity values by authoritative bodies along with their bases. EPA's value differs greatly from other agencies, even though most organizations relied upon the NTP bioassay. Many agencies reviewing the available scientific literature have concluded that the intestinal tumors in mice were the result of a non-mutagenic mode of action, supportive of threshold approaches for toxicity value derivation. These agencies have developed similar reference dose and TDI values and proposed similar water standards ranging from 30 to 100 parts per billion, whereas EPA has proposed 35 parts per trillion. This remarkable discrepancy is the result of EPA's unique conclusion that the tumors in the NTP study were the result of a mutagenic mode of action. Critical to arriving at a linear no threshold toxicity value, EPA scored 15 in vivo genotoxicity scores as having low confidence, despite characterizing them as generally well conducted. EPA argued that the concentrations employed in these studies were not high enough to assess genotoxicity. As shown in the tables on slide 2, the target tissue genotoxicity assays in rats and mice were conducted at the highest and carcinogenic concentrations for their respective species and sex in the NTP cancer bioassay, and were either already toxic to target tissues or higher concentrations were known to be overtly toxic. Contrary to EPA's concerns about the dose, Meta-analyses indicate that genotoxic carcinogens often elicit genotoxic responses at much lower concentrations than cancer. EPA's subjective use of dose selection in the study evaluations, an approach seemingly applied only to this subset of studies, represents a misuse of their study evaluation tool, and as a result, EPA inappropriately discounted relevant genotoxicity studies that directly contradict EPA's conclusion about the mode of action. Had these studies been scored appropriately, EPA may have reached conclusions similar to other authoritative bodies. Data also strongly support a non-genotoxic mode of action involving cytotoxicity and regenerative hyperplasia. Contrary to EPA's arguments in their toxicity review, mitotic index is not an ideal marker of cell proliferation in the intestine. Instead, crypt size and cellularity are more sensitive indicators of proliferation. EPA also argues that the minimal increase in average severity score for diffuse epithelial hyperplasia in the NTP cancer bioassay somehow provides evidence against the cytotoxic mode of action. However, the figures on slide 3 clearly indicate a progression in the number of mice with higher severity scores. In conclusion, EPA's updated toxicological review reveals a troubling disregard for state-of-the-art mode of action research that was envisioned in EPA's 2005 cancer guidelines. The agency's conclusions stand in stark contrast to those of other authoritative bodies throughout the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the panel? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to Mr. Green.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Joseph Green. I'm with Kelly Dry and Warren, and I serve as counsel to the specialty steel industry of North America. SSINA appreciates this opportunity to provide comments to the review panel. Stainless and many other specialty steels are iron-based alloys that often contain chromium. It is chromium that gives stainless its unique corrosion-resistant properties. Hexavalent chromium is not a constituent of these steels, but rather can be formed during certain manufacturing and processing activities. We are, of course, concerned about the proper regulatory and toxicological evaluation of chromium, particularly as regulations involving total chrome may result in overregulation of the more common and largely innocuous trivalent and metallic forms. For example, a total chromium drinking water standard that is based largely on the toxicity of hexchrome is inappropriate if imposed on other forms of chromium. For that reason, we have long advocated that separate drinking water standards for hexchrome and other forms of chromium should be adopted. We encourage the panel to carefully review the written comments submitted by SSINA and numerous other stakeholders, particularly the thoughtful and detailed scientific comments submitted on behalf of the American Chemistry Council, and about which you heard a little bit further just now from Chad. As noted in those comments, we urge EPA to complete the current IRIS assessment after considering all of the relevant information, including the results from the critical mode of action research that provide compelling evidence that there is a biological threshold for hexchrome toxicity. Unfortunately, the draft assessment largely dismisses the importance of this research, which significantly undermines the credibility of EPA's evaluation. Over a decade ago, EPA made the wise decision to allow more time for the science regarding hexchrome toxicity to develop, and it has. Crucial scientific studies have been completed and are now available to help fill the gaps in the science that existed over a decade ago when we were last here. That science is valid and cutting edge. We should use it. Instead of seriously considering the conclusions of that work, EPA has issued a draft assessment that largely repeats what the agency produced a decade ago. The result is an assessment that minimizes and dismisses the best recent science and offers a review that appears to reflect the desired predetermined outcome of a mutagenic mode of action, and that there is essentially no safe level for certain exposures to CR6. That conclusion is at odds with the weight of scientific evidence and the recent findings of numerous other authoritative bodies. The fact that the draft IRIS assessment is such a major departure from these findings calls into serious question whether an EPA's analysis is defensible. Given the major implications of the IRIS assessment for regulatory and tox purposes, it is essential that EPA gets this right and go back and perform an updated assessment. We encourage this panel to make recommendations that influence EPA in a proper scientific direction. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Green. Are there any questions from the panel? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to Ms. Conley.
Thank you. I'm Eileen Keneally from the American Chemistry Council.
I just wanted to note the EPA's draft assessment states that a mutagenic mode of action is sufficiently supported in laboratory animals and relevant to humans, and thus EPA uses a linear no threshold cancer slope factor approach. This claim is not supported by the weight of evidence. The weight of evidence supports a cytotoxic threshold mode of action for hexavalent chromium-induced intestinal tumors. Several authoritative bodies, as others have mentioned, have considered this weight of evidence, including Health Canada, the WHO, and the Food Safety Commission of Japan. Additionally, EPA's linear cancer slope factor approach is also inconsistent with published PBPK models, indicating that about 90% of hexavalent chromium ingestion at environmental levels is reduced to trivalent chromium in the stomach. As such, a strong pharmacokinetic evidence against linear risk within typical environmental exposure levels. The 2008 NTP cancer bioassay results provided initial evidence that the mode of action for the observed tumors might be non-mutagenic. Per the EPA cancer guidelines, mode of action analysis begins with clues from the chronic bioassays. The single tumor location in each species, the nonlinear dose response, the late tumor onset, and the high incidence of cytotoxicity-induced regenerative hyperplasia in the small intestine suggests that the tumors in the NTP bioassay were the result of a non-genotoxic mode of action. EPA inappropriately applied hazard identification design criteria to these gene tox studies that were designed to examine mode of action, wrongly concluding that the concentrations used in critical in vivo gene tox studies were not maximum tolerated doses, maximum feasible doses, or toxic to target tissue. Since 2008, approximately 15 in vivo gene tox assays have been published focusing on the mode of action. For the chromium-induced intestinal tumors in mice and oral tumors in rats. EPA has scored these assays as low confidence, asserting that all the studies failed to use the maximum tolerated dose and/or lack of toxicity in the target tissues. This reflects a misunderstanding of risk assessment and the use of gene tox data for informing mode of action, as well as a misunderstanding of OECD guidelines along with their application to mode of action studies. Testing to a maximum tolerated dose is important for hazard identification, but it's not the basis for dose selection for gene tox studies for mode of action. And finally, I would note that Health Canada and the WHO have set drinking water standards protective of cancer equivalent to 50,000 parts per trillion. In contrast, EPA's use of a linear cancer slope factor would correspond to a drinking water value of 35 parts per trillion. This is nearly 3,000 times lower than EPA's current drinking water standard of 100 parts per billion for total chromium, which I would note assumes 100% hexavalent chromium in the water. Average groundwater concentrations in the United States range from 1,000 to 5,000 parts per trillion. And this would play out that the EPA cancer slope factor approach would falsely imply that over half the water supplies in the United States pose a risk to public health. Thank you. I appreciate your consideration.
Thank you, Ms. Keneally. Are there any questions from the panel? Nope. Next, Mr. Hannafel.
Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Hannafel, and my remarks today are on behalf of the National Association for Surface Finishing, the leading trade association for electroplating, anodizing, and the broader surface technology industry serving the automotive, defense, aerospace, electronics, energy, medical, agriculture, and other essential supply chains. The NASF is concerned that EPA's draft IRIS assessment for hexavalent chromium does not appear to be scientifically supportable. And after over 10 years, EPA has reached essentially the same conclusion that it did a decade ago. EPA's evaluation of scientific literature appears to have dismissed the importance of the most recent high-quality research studies that support a threshold mode of action. For example, EPA rejected several credible peer-reviewed studies due to low exposures in animal studies, even though these exposures were hundreds of thousands times higher than the draft IRIS assessment's derived safe drinking water value of 35 parts per trillion. Furthermore, EPA's review in the draft IRIS assessment has yielded conclusions enormously different than other global authoritative bodies that reviewed and evaluated essentially the same scientific studies, yet reached profoundly different conclusions. For example, the World Health Organization in 2020 recommended a value of 50 parts per billion of total chromium as safe in drinking water. The Food Safety Commission of Japan in 2019 concluded that the available science would support a safe level of hexavalent chromium in the range of 30 to 60 parts per billion. And Health Canada in 2018 issued a maximum acceptable concentration of 50 parts per billion for total chromium. These authoritative bodies concluded that the available science supported a threshold mode of action and safe level in drinking water that were 3 orders of magnitude less stringent than EPA's safe value. Now, despite all of the evidence to support the contrary, EPA concluded there was a mutagenic mode of action with essentially no safe levels for exposure to hexavalent chromium. In fact, it appears that EPA is taking great lengths to reach this conclusion, including the dismissal of current mode of action research. EPA's analysis in the draft IRIS assessment includes a number of inconsistencies, errors, and other deficiencies that lead to a questionable conclusion in the draft toxicity values for hexavalent chromium. The use of this faulty approach could have significant negative impacts on how EPA conducts future IRIS assessments and develops federal regulations, including drinking water standards. Before finalizing the IRIS assessment for hexavalent chromium, NASF urges the SAB to include all relevant peer-reviewed studies in their assessment and consider the scientific review and conclusions by other global authoritative bodies. Thank you for your time and consideration of these issues.
Thank you, Mr. Hannafel. Any questions from the panel? Okay, moving on. Mr. Chadovich.
Thank you so much. My name is Chuck Chadovitz, and I'm Vice President of Environmental Affairs and Sustainability at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The Chamber appreciates the opportunity to provide input today on this important role of sound risk management and environmental stewardship. EPA Science Advisory Board is the right venue for robust peer-reviewed processes to evaluate the appropriate risk for chromium compounds. We appreciate the opportunity to comment on behalf of the Chamber, our member companies, trade associations, and state and local chambers which span key U.S. supply chains using chromium and chromium compounds, and whose products and technologies are essential to America's economic growth, water infrastructure, and national security. The Chamber and our members are committed to managing chemicals and products safely and protecting human health and the environment based on risk and the best science. We have concerns about EPA's draft IRIS human health assessment for hexavalent chromium, including the quality of the agency's evaluation of the science supporting its conclusions, and potentially severe and unjustified economic consequences of its analysis regarding future federal drinking water and other EPA standards. Scientifically robust, transparent, realistic, and defensible IRIS assessments are critical in the evaluation of chemicals, as these assessments ultimately lead to risk management measures that have impacts up and down the supply chain and affect production of critical and innovative materials and technologies. We are concerned that the draft Chrome 6 assessments results and highlight the deficiencies of the IRIS process and reflect the unwarranted departure from decisions of other highly respected authoritative bodies as identified by my colleagues today. The following are several key issues for your consideration. First, EPA's draft conclusions do not appear to be scientifically supportable. EPA's analysis appears to minimize the importance of high quality research. It concludes that there is essentially no safe level for certain exposures to Chrome 6, despite the overwhelming scientific evidence contradicting this conclusion and the conclusions of other authoritative bodies. This disparity calls into serious question whether EPA's analysis is scientifically supportable. Second, EPA's assessment is out of step with these other authoritative bodies, and my other colleagues have identified the differences between the World Health Organization, Health Canada, and the Food Safety Commission of Japan, as they concluded current available science supported a safe level range of between 30 and 60 parts per billion. EPA's draft IRIS assessment would lead to an extremely low tap water value. The draft assessment is nearly 3,000 times lower than EPA's current drinking water standard of 100 parts per billion for total chromium, based on the assumption that 100% of hexavalent chromium in water. Results from a series of state-of-the-art peer-reviewed studies provide support that the current EPA drinking water standard is human health protective. Next, the draft assessment inaccurately applies that over half the water supplies in the U.S. pose a risk to public health. This potential tap water value of 35 parts per trillion is orders of a magnitude below the average groundwater concentration of of Chrome-6 in the US, which ranges from 1 to 5 parts per billion to 1,000 to 5,000 parts per trillion. This implication is false and could lead to massive yet unnecessary costs to water systems, remediation projects, and the like, with little or no measurable public health benefit. Not only does EPA analysis raise important analytical questions, but stakeholders are concerned that the use of such flawed analysis as the underpinning for future IRIS assessments and federal regulatory actions, including drinking water remediation standards, would lead to overly restrictive and counterproductive approaches to safe uses under TSCA. We urge the SAB to include additional peer-reviewed and international studies in their evaluation and careful review prior to the agency's final decision. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Any questions from the panel? Okay, hearing none, move on. Dr. Choksky?
Thank you. My name is Mipa Choksky. I'm with Talk Strategies, and my comments today will focus on the systematic review and study evaluation methodology used by the EPA in its evaluation of Chromium-6. My remarks will highlight the inconsistent and inappropriate application of these methods to selected subset in the review of the literature evaluated. EPA consistently applied their standard systematic review methodology in its review of mode of action studies. While the EPA stated that the process of evaluating mechanistic information differs fundamentally from evaluations of other evidence streams, there is no rationale or support provided for the statement. Simply because data belong to a different evidence stream does not suggest or warrant that it should be evaluated differently from other evidence streams, particularly considering that these data were directly used to inform the risk assessment decisions. For example, included mechanistic data were not equally subjected to formal study evaluation process. Only a selected subset, less than 5% of the mechanistic studies, were evaluated for risk of bias and sensitivity. EPA does not provide guidance or the process that was used for the identification of this subset of mechanistic studies. Obscure statements such as preliminary evaluations were conducted for select study types add to the confusion, and lack of transparency regarding the methodology used to select mechanistic studies subjected to study evaluation. A second inconsistency in the application of the systematic review methodology was the inclusion of a parameter relating to external or construct validity criteria during an assessment of internal validity when using the risk of bias tools and guidance for the hand-selected set of studies. One of the criteria included in the applied risk of bias tool was assessment of exposure methods and sensitivity. As described in the agency handbook and the Chromium-6 protocol, this metric is used to assess the utility of the exposure regimen, that exposure endpoint. Specifically, the timing, frequency, and duration of the exposure regimen are evaluated. The relevance of the tested dose is not described as being evaluated in this metric. Nonetheless, EPA repeatedly decreased the rating for this domain in hand-selected subset of the mechanistic studies due to purported deficiencies in the dose, while at the same time directly acknowledging that the studies were well conducted, which is generally the intent of the risk of bias assessment. For example, the micronucleus assay conducted as part of the guideline-based evaluation conducted by the National Toxicology Program was classified as having low reliability. EPA stated all conditions regarding treatment schedule, administration, and number of dose groups were appropriate for both studies. Despite such, the metric and hence the study confidence overall was decreased due to a purported deficiency of the doses tested. The inaccuracy of this categorization has already been addressed by my colleague, Dr. Thompson. Post hoc refinement of study evaluation criteria, inclusion of aspects related to external and construct validity to assessment of internal validity, both done without justification, is not appropriate application of the systematic review process. Further, supporting the subjective nature of the evaluation of these mechanistic studies, it is notable that EPA applied different criteria and inconsistent application of the risk of bias tool in the evaluation of other endpoints and outcomes. Compared to the genotoxicity endpoint, where dose concerns were repeatedly used to decrease the assessment of study reliability, EPA did not mention concerns with dose or apply similar criteria to other data streams, such as the reproductive and developmental toxicity endpoint. While the OECD developmental test guideline describes dose selection criteria similar to those applied for genotoxicity data, The application or lack thereof of this criterion was not noted in the evaluation rationale. The inconsistent application of study evaluation tools suggests a bias in the evaluation of the experimental animal mutagenicity data. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Any questions from the panel? Okay, now we'll cycle back to Dr. Cohen. Dr. Cohen?
I'll try again. My
Okay.
name is Sam Cohen. I'm a professor in the Department of Pathology and Microbiology and the Buffett Cancer Center at the University of Nebraska Medical Center. I'm a practicing surgical pathologist, and I have been involved with chemical carcinogenesis research for nearly 60 years. I have not received funding for my review of the Chromium information, nor my presentation today. In the Chromium assessment a report by IRIS, there are serious flaws in the interpretation of the data regarding the duodenum. To begin with, Chromium-6 does not reach the duodenal crypts, which are the cells that will eventually become cancer with Chromium administration. They only reach the villi, which are going to be sloughed. And it's in the sloughing of that they'll be replaced by proliferation in the crypts. IRIS refers in their assessment of the short-term studies, particularly the genotoxicity studies involving the duodenum, that there is no evidence of duodenal toxicity nor evidence of increased cell proliferation. Both of these statements are incorrect. With regard to evidence of toxicity, they state that there are macrophages in the lamina propria of the duodenal villi, not the crypts, and that these macrophages, along with the other mononuclear cells that are present, actually represent a foreign body granulomatous inflammatory reaction. This is clearly evidence indicative of cytotoxicity injury, and the OECD guidelines precludes interpreting a positive genotoxic response at cytotoxic levels. They also indicate that there is hyperplasia present in the crypts, in the duodenum, but the labeling index is not increased, so they therefore concluded that there's not an increase in cell proliferation. This is nonsense. Hyperplasia by definition is an increase in the cell number. That's by definition. Just because there's not an increase in the rate of proliferation does not mean that there's not an increase in cell proliferation. In the crypts of the intestine, there already is a very high labeling index, and generally the evaluation of increased proliferation in the crypts of the intestine, both small and large intestine, are to measure the length of the crypts and evaluating the total number of cells. By increasing the number of cells, you're increasing the denominator, and therefore, even at a rate that's similar to controls, you have increased cell proliferation. The intestine, an assessment of proliferation is made by measuring the length, not the rate, anywhere in the intestine, actually in most of the GI tract itself. Since IRIS has gotten both of these factors incorrect regarding toxicity and proliferation, their conclusions regarding toxicity and genotoxicity are incorrect, making their overall assessment incorrect as well. There are no valid data supporting in vivo genotoxicity in the duodenum, and with negative in vivo duodenal genotoxicity data, that overrides any in vitro positives that they have seen before. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen. Any questions from the panel? Nope. I want to thank all of our public commentators for bringing their thoughts to the panel. We'll give them due consideration in our deliberations. Now we'll move on to the review of the charge questions, which Dr. Thayer will read the charge questions to us. And I think after each charge question, we'll pause and give a chance for the panel to ask any questions that they might have. Dr. Thayer?
Yeah, I think
before you begin, Chris, may I ask the public commenters that have completed their comments to now join us through the live stream and leave the Zoom call, please? Thank you. Okay.
Okay. And then Sue, my understanding is that the charge questions will be displayed in slides.
Yes. Will, can you help us with that, please?
It's good that we're taking a break after each one. Does anybody?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's good that we're taking a break in between them because they're pretty long. So.
Yeah, exactly. I guess we're waiting for the slides, I assume. Here we go.
All right, I'm mute. Charge question number 1. You can go ahead and advance. The toxicological review describes and applies a systematic review process for identifying and screening pertinent studies that is described in detail in section 1.2.1, literature search and screening, and appendix A, labeled the systematic review protocol. Please comment on whether the literature search strategy and screening criteria for Chromium-6 are appropriate and clearly described. Please identify additional peer-reviewed studies of Chromium-6 compounds that the assessment should consider. Do you want me to read the footnote as well, the asterisk?
I don't think that's necessary. We can skim it here because it's on our screens. Are there any questions from the panel on this one? No. Okay, let's move on.
Okay. Next slide, please. Charge question number 2. The toxicological review describes the results of the evaluations of individual studies in section 2.2, study evaluation results, and presents and analyzes the findings from those studies deemed informative in the relevant health effect specific synthesis sections. Charge 2.1a, results from individual Chromium-6 studies are presented and synthesized in the health system specific sections. Please comment on whether the presentation and analysis of study results is clear, appropriate, and effective to allow for scientifically supported synthesis of the findings across sets of studies. Sub-question 2b, please comment on whether the study confidence conclusions for the Chromium-6 studies are scientifically justified, giving appropriate consideration to important methodological features of the assessed outcomes. Please specify any study confidence conclusions that are not justified and explain any alternative study evaluation decisions.
Okay. Any questions from the panel? Nope. Let's move on.
Okay. Charge question number 3, non-cancer hazard identification and toxicity value derivation. For each health effect considered in the assessment and outlined below, please comment on whether the available data have been clearly and appropriately synthesized to describe the strength and limitations and to support the conclusions presented. For each, please also comment on whether the weight of evidence decisions for hazard identification have been clearly described and scientifically justified, and appropriately consider health effects in susceptible subpopulations or life stages, for example, children, to the extent possible, given the available data. In addition, please separately comment on whether the dose response decisions are transparent and scientifically justified, including study selection for dose response analyses, point of departure or POD estimates, including modeling choices and assumptions and dosimetric adjustments, selection of uncertainty factors and derivation of candidate values, selection of organ/system specific RFDs, RFCs, and confidence in the calculated values. And then we have 3A, which focuses on gastrointestinal, non-cancer. The evidence indicates that oral exposure to Chromium-6 likely causes GI tract toxicity in humans given sufficient exposure conditions. This conclusion is primarily based on robust studies in rodents that found Chromium-6 causes non-neoplastic effects in the GI tract.
Are there questions on so far on this charge question 3? Seeing none, let's move on.
I think Gloria has a
Yeah, I have a
Gloria's
question.
got one. Dr. Post?
I have, my questions are really about, to me, it's unclear. It seemed that several of the questions, I'm not clear of the distinction, and it appears there's overlap. So the first one It has to do with questions 3, 4, 5, and 6. Between them, there's overlap that I'm not clear of the difference between them. So should I ask the question now, even though it applies to also to other questions we haven't gotten to yet?
Yeah, let's get it on the table and we'll come back to it, as we progress, but let's start with it. Sure.
I actually made a table for myself to get it straight. So question 3 is about non-cancer effects, and it asks about modeling choices and assumptions, but question 4 is about both cancer and non-cancer effects, and it does mention benchmark dose modeling, but it still also asks about the appropriateness of the modeling choices and assumptions. So it's like you would want one answer for that, not different answers in different charge questions. And also both question 3 and question 5 ask about, if the choice of uncertainty factors and the rationale for the uncertainty factors for non-cancer for reference doses and reference concentrations are appropriate. So I just thought it wasn't clear of what those differences are. The other one has to do with, I guess question 6 and question 4 both ask, that's for cancer. It asks about modeling choices and assumptions in both of them. So that's my question overall.
So, okay, so what do we think? Do we want to sort of jump ahead, or do we want to kind of hold these questions and then reflect on the potential overlaps? I'm happy to do whatever.
I think the fundamental question has to do with you're asking for the same basic information in multiple questions. Where should we provide it?
Yeah.
That by different people if different people contributed, to different questions, you wouldn't want it that way. It should all be together.
Well, I'm going to give a chance for the team to kind of weigh in here after I sort of make my remarks, but I would sort of say put it in the sort of the most, if you're finding in multiple places, put it in the one that's attached to a more specific decision. It could be that sort of the general considerations that we want you to think about are sort of highlighted here, and then we drill down towards sort of specific decisions for specific endpoints. So I would my thought is when you find what appears to be straight up duplication, to sort of put it in a more specific place. But let me go ahead and open it up and see if the team has a different perspective on that.
Yeah, sorry, Chris, I actually don't have anything to add to that. I agree. It should just be where it seems most appropriate and most relevant.
Would I be able to add a question to this? It's kind of
Yes.
a similar question, and it relates to question 3 versus question 2. It seems like question 2 is kind of an omnibus one, and it comments on evaluation of all the studies and a description and whether the confidence levels are justified. And it seems to me that question 3 goes into more depth on that. So if you can maybe comment on the difference between charge question 2 and 3. Because it seems like, if you're talking about strengths and limitations to support the conclusion, by definition, you're going to have to evaluate the evidence that was used and the confidence level that was ascribed to these studies, which is charge question 2. But then you repeat it in question 3.
Yep. And I'm going to sort of give my answer and then again, open it up to the team if they want to sort of elaborate. But my read of charge question 2 is really more the walk up. So in question 3, you're really looking for the hazard. You're really looking for conclusions across studies, that process of synthesizing across study. And 2, when you're talking about some of the study evaluation considerations, you're talking about analysis of individual studies. And then they kind of roll up into charge question 3 conclusions.
Okay. And I suppose that's fine, but if you're having different people do charge question 2 as compared to charge question 3, and the people in 2 walk up to the evidence and then the people in 3 don't carry that assessment forward, I'm worried about inconsistencies in the discussion. And I wonder if charge question 2 should be subset in the 3A and 3B. So instead of having a separate charge question 2, embed that within charge question 3 instead. This may be a 3A 1-1 or something like that. I just worry about the flow of things because it seems like it's going to be very disruptive.
Yeah, I'll just jump in here. I do think that this may be problematic in the face-to-face, and I would encourage people to feel free to write responses to charge questions to which they were not assigned. So if you're assigned something in part 3 and you think there's some problems with the evaluations of the individual studies, write some comments and send them along to charge question 2, because you can write responses to all questions that you see fit. This is something we're probably going to have to sort out at the face-to-face.
Maybe, Dr. Mars, do you think it's a good idea if someone's the more specific question about uncertainty factors that we haven't gotten to, for example, then when they write that response, say this may also apply to question 3 or whatever, just so everyone's aware when they write something like that?
Yes.
Okay.
Dr. Lash?
Yeah. I was looking back at the document. I was wondering how well the questions respond to the sections. Trying to think maybe that's part of how it was done, because in section 2, there is the literature search and study evaluation results, and the that's just presented, whereas section 3 has the hazard identification. So and so it may be presented some of the same information or discussion of the same sets of studies is repeated, but in a different way. I don't know. But I guess the questions don't align with the section. So I was trying to figure out how to look at it. I don't know if there's any validity to that, or any comment on that.
I'll just offer a little bit of insight since I've worked on these kinds of assessments and report writing over the years. You will notice that throughout the writing process that many of the recommendations will be repeated for multiple questions. And what we try to do is crosswalk at some point, harken back to, as we said in charge question 2, for example. These were the deficiencies in the analysis of these studies, or something to that effect. So I think at the beginning, everybody can focus in on their particular charge, and then we will have to integrate that information where it seems appropriate and where there are redundancies in some of the recommendations that are made. And if there are inconsistencies between recommendations in one place versus another, maybe trying to reconcile at that point. Once we get everything written down, we'll see that a little bit better, and then we can work on fixing it. So that's just my perspective on having worked on these kinds of reports over the years.
Okay, thank you. That helps. And we'll all be in the same room together for a couple of days to iron all this out, right? When we start hearing all the comments. I mean, I think one of the problems is that we're trying to write integrated responses on complex problems, and it's difficult to parse them into very separate issues because they do all overlap conceptually.
Right. And that's actually the challenge, one of the challenges of writing the charge questions as well. And so the way they are rated here kind of aligns with the steps of assessment development.
Yeah, okay. Are we all comfortable with where we are on this at this point? I think we're okay. Let's move on.
Okay, charge question number 3 continued. A PUD from NTP 2008 a 2-year drinking water bioassay in rodents was selected to calculate an organ system specific RFD of 9 times 10 to the minus 4 milligrams per kilogram per day based on diffuse epithelial hyperplasia in the female mouse small intestine. A composite uncertainty factor of 100 was used to account for interspecies, animal to human, and low AL to no AL uncertainties. This organ/system specific RFD, organ-specific RFD, was selected as the overall RFD. Please comment on whether the selection of the overall RFD is scientifically justified and clearly described. Charge question 3, part 3, Roman numeral 3. EPA determined that the data set for diffuse epithelial hyperplasia of the duodenum in female mice from NTP 2008 was not amenable to BMD modeling because uncertainty in estimating the BMD is too high. As a result, the low AL was used as a POD for toxicity value derivation of this endpoint in female mice. Female mouse hyperplasia was selected as the organ-specific RFD for gastrointestinal toxicity because females may be the more sensitive group. However, alternate approaches are presented and weighed in the toxicological review. Please comment specifically on whether the data and the modeling decisions for the organ-specific RFD for gastrointestinal tract toxicity are scientifically justified and clearly described.
Okay, any questions? Seeing none, we can move on.
Okay, so this is charge question 3, continued, respiratory non-cancer outside of nasal cavity. The evidence indicates that inhalation exposure to chromium-6 likely causes lower respiratory tract effects in humans given sufficient exposure conditions. This conclusion is primarily based on inflammatory effects indicative of lung injury in medium confidence animal studies, supported by observations of decreased lung function among chromium-exposed workers in low confidence human studies, and mechanistic observations that support the biological plausibility of an inflammatory tissue response following chromium-6 exposure that is interpreted to lead to impaired function or adverse structural changes. Please comment on whether this conclusion is scientifically justified and clearly described. 3B, part 2, a POD from Glazier et al. 1990, a 90-day inhalation bioassay in rodents, was selected to calculate an organ system RFC of 10 to the minus 4 milligrams per meter cubed based on histopathological cellular responses in the lung. For most endpoints that served as the basis for this organ system RFC, a composite uncertainty factor of 1,000 was used to account for intraspecies, animal to human, subchronic to chronic, low AL to low AL, and database deficiency uncertainties. Please comment on whether the selection of this selection is scientifically justified and clearly described.
Any questions? All right, let's move on.
Charge question 3 continued.
Oh, more on the, okay.
Respiratory, non-cancer nasal cavity. This is charge question 3, part C, Roman numeral 1. As noted in Appendix A, Systematic Review Protocol, a determination that evidence demonstrates chromium-6 causes nasal lesion in humans was adopted from the 1998 IRIS assessment. A POD from Gibb et al. 2000A was selected to calculate the organ system RFC of 10 to the minus 5 milligrams per meter cubed based on ulceration of the nasal septum. A composite uncertainty factor of 300 was used to account for intraspecies, subchronic to chronic, low AL to no AL, and database deficiency uncertainties. This organ system RFC was selected as the overall RFC. Please comment on whether the selection of the overall RFC is scientifically justified and clearly described.
Okay, any questions? Nope, all right, we'll move on.
Charge question 3 continued again. D, hepatic. The evidence indicates that chromium-6 likely causes hepatic effects in humans given sufficient exposure conditions. This conclusion is primarily based on studies in animals that observe hepatic effects with increasing drinking water exposure levels. Increased clinical chemistry markers for liver dysfunction, ALT and AST, as well as increased chronic inflammation and fatty changes were seen across animal studies. Please comment on whether this conclusion is scientifically justified and clearly described. hepatic part 2. A POD from NTP 2008, a 2-year drinking water bioassay in rodents, was selected to calculate an organ system RFD of 7 to -4 milligrams per kilogram per day based on chronic inflammation in female rats. A composite uncertainty factor of 100 was used to account for interspecies animal to human and low AL to no AL uncertainties. Please comment on whether this selection is scientifically justified and clearly described.
Any questions? Seeing none, we'll move on.
Ooh. Okay, continued small text. I hope I can read this.
Yeah.
Developmental. The evidence indicates that chromium-6 likely causes developmental effects in humans given sufficient exposure conditions. This conclusion is primarily based on the observations of decreased offspring growth across most animal studies, as evidenced by decreased fetal or postnatal body weights and decreased skeletal ossification. Other outcomes in animal studies are more uncertain because they were inconsistent among high and medium confidence studies or were evaluated only in low confidence studies. Likewise, the available human data were of low confidence and difficult to interpret. Please comment on whether this conclusion is scientifically justified and clearly described. Development part 2. A POD from NTP 1997, a continuous breeding study of Bobsy mice, was used to derive an organ system RFD of 0.07 milligrams per kilogram per day based on decreased F1 offspring postnatal growth. A composite uncertainty factor of 10 was used to account for interspecies and animal to human uncertainties. It should be noted that the decreased F1 offspring growth effect was observed at maternal dose of 24.4 milligrams per kilogram per day, which is a relatively high dose associated with overt toxicity in other studies. Both indirect, maternal or paternal, and direct route of exposures to the developing organisms were considered during hazard assessment. It is frequently difficult to determine whether effects on the fetus are in response to or separate from maternal toxicity in studies that report both. And so the fetal endpoints were considered in conjunction with the maternal endpoints described in the female reproductive effects section. Developmental effects at doses that cause minimal maternal toxicity and are still considered to represent developmental toxicity and should not be discounted as maternal toxicity. And it cites EPA guidelines 1991. However, because this effect only occurred in high dose groups where other toxicological effects, as indicated by the lower points of departure for other toxicities, may be occurring, this organ system RFD was assigned low confidence. Please comment on whether this selection is scientifically justified and clearly described.
Any questions?
Yep, just a quick question. So are the folks that are reviewing this and or are reviewing reproductive effects basically having to cross review or how is that envisioned here? Because it seems like for part of these conclusions, there's reference to another section and vice versa. So, or at least for here to reproductive effects. So just wondering how you envision reviewers on the panel to handle this.
Is that a question for EPA or the chair?
Both, I guess, but EPA.
I think there will have to be some cross-fertilization.
Yeah, I think there'll have to be. We'll all get copies of everyone's comments, so we can go back and forth. And these are the sorts of things that we can work through at the face-to-face.
All right.
Does that sound right, Sue? She knows better than me.
Yes, I think we will have to work through it once we get together, but I do recommend to those who are assigned to the developmental question and the repro question to certainly be familiar with both of those sections so that you can sort of inform your responses appropriately.
Have these assignments to sections already been made? Have I missed something or not yet?
They have already been made, yeah. Okay. When we sent out the chair's memo, we had assignments to the charge questions. There have been a few alterations, but if you're not aware that your assignment has been altered, then it's probably has not. But I've talked to a few individuals and I'll be sending an email after today's meeting to sort of discuss next steps and to make sure that everybody knows which question they were assigned. So I'll resend that.
And then also, I mean, what we're talking about here really is the more specific maternal toxicity element of the reproductive section, if that makes it any easier.
Okay,
Thank you.
I think we can move on.
You guessed it. Board charge question number 3, hematological. Evidence suggests that chromium-6 may cause hematological effects in humans given sufficient exposure condition. This conclusion is based primarily on modern animal evidence from high and medium confidence subchronic and chronic studies in rats and mice reporting consistent, dose-related, and coherent findings at 22 to 90-day exposures. However, the magnitude of the collective effects decreased by 12 months, with many findings returning to normal or near normal levels. Organ system specific reference doses were derived based on short-term hematological effects because factors demonstrated a credible concern for greater toxicity in a susceptible population and life stage. And this would be individuals with iron deficient anemia and pregnant women who are susceptible to developing iron deficient anemia. Please comment on whether this conclusion is scientifically justified and clearly described. A POD from NTP 2008, a 2-year drinking water bioassay in rodents, was selected to calculate an organ system RFD of 0.01 milligram per kilogram per day based on decreased hemoglobin in male rats reported at 22 days. A composite uncertainty factor of 10 was used to account for intraspecies and animal to human uncertainties. A subchronic to chronic uncertainty factor was not applied because this effect was observed to ameliorate with chronic features. Please comment on whether the selection is scientifically justified and clearly described.
Okay, any questions? Hearing none, we'll move on. Big print.
Yeah, yay. Charge question 3, part G, immune. Evidence suggests that chromium-6 may modulate the immune system in humans through both stimulatory and suppressive actions given sufficient exposure conditions. This conclusion is primarily based on coherent evidence of effects on ex vivo white blood count function across human and animal studies, antibody responses to T-cell dependent antigen measured in animals, and reduction in host resistance to bacterial infection reported in animal studies. However, confidence in the evidence was reduced because some of the studies are low confidence and reported findings often differed across studies. No reference values were derived for this system. Please comment on whether this conclusion is scientifically justified and clearly described.
Any questions? Nope. All right.
Charge question number 3, continued, part H, male reproductive. Evidence suggests that chromium-6 may cause male reproductive toxicity in humans given sufficient exposure condition. This conclusion is primarily based on coherent evidence of effects across human and animal studies. Decreased testosterone and decreased sperm quantity and quality were observed in both humans and animal studies. However, interpretation of this evidence was limited because most studies that observed these effects were considered low confidence, and there was inconsistency with higher confidence studies. No reference values were derived for this system. Please comment on whether this conclusion is scientifically justified and clearly described.
Any questions? Don't see any, so we can keep going.
Charge question 3, continued, female reproductive. Evidence is inadequate to assess whether chromium-6 may cause female reproductive effects in humans. Although an association with female reproductive toxicity was demonstrated in a single low confidence epidemiology study and a series of low confidence animal toxicology studies, effects observed in medium or high confidence studies aside from a moderate decrease in maternal body weight. No reference values were derived for the system. Please comment on whether this conclusion is scientifically justified and clearly described.
Questions? Nope. You can drink your Coke and then we can move on.
Oh, Yay, charge question 4.
Or
EPA used benchmark dose BMD modeling to identify points of departure, or PODs, for the following chromium-6 induced health effects observed in rodents: respiratory, gastrointestinal, which would be both cancer and non-cancer, and hepatic. Are the modeling approaches used, selection and justification of benchmark response levels, and the selective models used to identify each POD for toxicity value derivation scientifically justified and clearly described?
okay, I don't see any questions, though we can see the overlap between this and question 2 and question 3. But I think we've discussed that already. So we'll move on.
Okay, charge question 5, small print. EPA applied a series of 5 uncertainty factors to the POD developed for each non-cancer related endpoint study, specifically addressing the following areas of uncertainty: intraspecies uncertainty, or UFH, to account for variation in susceptibility across the human population, and the possibility that the available data may not be representative of individuals who are most susceptible to the effect. Interspecies uncertainty, UFA, to account for animal to human extrapolation and consisting of equal parts representing pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic differences. Subchronic to chronic uncertainty, or UFS, to account for the uncertainty in using subchronic studies to make inferences about lifetime exposure, and to consider whether lifetime exposure would have effects at lower levels, for example, for studies other than subchronic studies. Low AL to no AL uncertainty, or UFL, to infer an exposure level where effects are not expected when a POD is based on a lowest observed adverse effect level, low AL, and database uncertainty, or UFD, to account for database deficiencies if an incomplete database raises concern that further studies might identify a more sensitive effect, organ system, or life stage.
Okay. Any questions on this one? Nope, don't see any. All right, we'll move on.
Okay, has part 5, charge question 5 continued. 5A, has uncertainty been adequately accounted for in the derivation of the reference values? Please describe and provide recommendations if needed. Charge question 5, part B. To inform uncertainty in intraspecies variability, UFH, the assessment evaluates and considers the available evidence on potential susceptibility to chromium-6 with different populations or life stages, including any potential human health impacts from early life exposure. Monte Carlo analysis using pharmacokinetic modeling was applied to account for pharmacokinetic variability in the average general adult population following oral exposure. As a result, for effects via the oral route, the UFH was lowered from 10, and 3 was retained for the pharmacodynamic variability. However, there may be residual pharmacokinetic variabilities for susceptible populations outside the capabilities of the standard adult-based model. These cannot be quantified or are discussed qualitatively in the assessment. Is the rationale for the UFH of 3 scientifically justified and clearly described?
Any questions? Seeing none, okay, we'll move on.
Charge question 5 continued. This is part C. A database uncertainty factor UFD of 3 was applied to inhalation respiratory effects, both human nasal and animal lower respiratory. A value of less than 10 was applied because respiratory tract effects of inhaled chromium-6 were considered portal of entry effects and are therefore likely to be amongst the most sensitive based on current understanding of pharmacokinetics and mechanisms following inhalation. A value of UFD equals 3 as opposed to UFD equals 1 was applied because many of the inhalation studies were low confidence, particularly for non-cancer effects outside the portals of entry, and limited in scope, working age and mostly male humans and only male rodents. Due to pharmacokinetic differences from oral exposure, chromium-6 is detoxified in the gut and liver on first pass. The stronger oral database, UFD equals 1 for effects following oral exposure, could not be used to inform the UFD for inhalation effects. Is the rationale scientifically justified and clearly described?
Questions? Okay, we can move on.
Charge question 5 continued. A subchronic to chronic uncertainty factor UFS of 3 was applied to human nasal effects. While data were not from chronic lifetime exposures, the nasal effects were observed to have a short onset time. This may indicate that nasal effects occur following short-term occupational exposures to high concentrations of Chrome-6 when significant impaction of large particles or mist containing Chrome-6 occurs along the nasal passages. Based on the available evidence, it is considered less likely that exposure to Chrome-6 outside of occupational settings, where particles are larger, would induce nasal perforations, ulcerations at much lower concentrations and smaller particle sizes. As a result, a factor of USF less than 10 was applied. Because it is possible that prolonged exposure to high concentrations may increase the severity of existing nasal lesions that after they occur, a value of UFS equals 3 as opposed to UFS equals 1 was applied. Is the rationale scientifically justified and clearly described?
Any questions? Nope. Okay, we'll go on.
Charge question 6. Carcinogenicity, hazard identification, and toxicity value derivation. For each cancer-related health effect and decision outlined below, please comment on whether the available data have been clearly and appropriately synthesized to describe the strength and limitations and to support the conclusions presented. For each, please also comment on whether the weight of evidence decision for hazard identification have been clearly described and scientifically justified. In addition, please separately comment on whether the dose response decisions are transparent and scientifically justified, including study selection for dose response analysis, point of departure estimates, including modeling choices and assumptions, and dosimetric adjustments, derivation of candidate values, and confidence in the calculated values.
Dr. Eastman has a question.
Okay.
All right. This has to do with the other, subparts coming up, but it strikes me as that, so there's parts A, B, C, D, and E. And from my reading on this, parts A and C are hazard identification. B, D, and E are dose response related. So it's hard when you say for each, comment on whether the weight of evidence decisions for hazard identification been clearly described. Because it's not, I'm saying that directly applies to 2 of the 5, but not the other 3. And I guess my take on this would be, my interpretation would be to ignore the hazard identification and just say for all of them, have the weight of evidence decisions been clearly described? And then for the latter portion of this, the portion that deals with the dose response analyses, really only applying those to the ones that relate to dose response and not to all of them. Does that make sense?
I'm looking to Dr. Morris, if you want to take first shot at it.
Oh, I'm looking at you.
All right. I'm just pulling up my cheat sheet with charge question 6 with the different parts on it. Yeah. And I kind of want to open it up to the team, but I think what you're saying is that about kind of for the more dose response pieces of this question, then it would make less sense to kind of focus on all the hazard identification considerations. But are you talking about the sequence of the sub questions?
Well, part of this is just going to use best judgment on it as I go through, but specifically saying for every one of these, each of the questions, comment on whether the weight of evidence decisions for hazard identification have been clearly described. And I'm not sure how that applies to some of these questions. I could say if we were looking at weight of evidence decisions have been clearly described, that's a little easier to make sense of. And that's probably what I would do, but I'm not, anyway.
Yep.
I'm just hoping for some clarification because I rearranged these questions as I would write them and said, how would I respond to A? How do I respond to B, C, D, and E? And then you plot this in and you say, well, this part doesn't really apply to that, and yet we're supposed to comment on all of them. So I'm guessing just you're recommendation is use our best judgment. I'm hoping that that would be okay, but
Yeah, I would say so. And again, I'm going to sort of give you a response and then open it up to my team if they want to elaborate. But again, these are kind of structured according to the sequences. So we would do hazard identification before sort of thinking about the study selection for dose response and then implementing dose response. So that's kind of the sequence. And then along the way, if there are sort of specific mechanistic questions or, pharmacokinetic questions, they kind of get added in as charge questions. But it really follows sort of the sequence of the steps in conducting the assessment. And again, I want to see if anybody, so I would say, yes, use your best judgment, but that's kind of the rationale for the current sequencing. But I want to defer to my team to see if they have anything to elaborate.
Yeah, I'll just say, I don't have anything to add to that. I think you're both right, and to use your best judgment. I think a lot of times we try to cover so many bases in these charge questions that there may be some slight inconsistencies like this, but definitely, I think what you proposed, Dr. Eastman, sounds logical to me and would be sufficient, or more than sufficient.
no, it's fine. I mean, because usually you go through sort of that sequential thing, but it starts with hazard identification, then dose response, then back to hazard identification, then dose response and dose response. And yet it says cover this for all of them. So I actually thought it was well written to can pull it all together in one paragraph. So that was very well done, but it made it a little harder for me to try and figure out the next points, but that's fine. I'll work through it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And you certainly could write in an answer to a specific question that this is a dose response question, and therefore I'm not discussing hazard identification issues, right? Just put it in there.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Are we ready to go to the next?
Yeah, we are.
I think we're closing in on being done with them.
Yeah.
Although this has some subparts. Charge question 6, continued A. EPA concluded that a mutagenic MOA for Chromium-6 carcinogenicity is sufficiently supported in laboratory animals and relevant to humans. The determination applies to both oral and inhalation exposures. For inhalation, there was consistent evidence from humans exposed occupationally. For the oral route of exposure, the small evidence base of low confidence animal mutagenicity studies of drinking water exposures was supported by strong evidence of mutagenicity of Chromium-6 in test systems using more direct exposure methods, for example, IP injection in vitro, and a biologically plausible pharmacokinetic mechanism for Chromium-6 distributing to tumor target tissues and being taken up and reduced intracellularly to induce toxic and genotoxic effects.
I think we got to go to the next slide where the question is.
I think you're right.
There aren't questions.
It's the statement.
They're just these are all statements.
Right. Yeah, they're all statements that stem from the original question.
But you have to go back to the original thing to figure out what you're supposed to answer.
Gotcha.
And that's why I found it confusing, because they're different parts of questions.
I understand. Right. So I guess we'll move on then, because we've got all the big questions from above.
Right. Okay, so 6B, because tumors in rodents and humans were observed in or proximal to portals of entry where cellular uptake of Chromium-6 may occur prior to detoxification to Chromium-3, and because a mutagenic MOA for Chromium-6 carcinogenicity is sufficiently supported in laboratory animals and relevant to humans, EPA applied low-dose linear approach for both the oral and inhalation routes of exposure. In the absence of chemical-specific data to evaluate differences in age-specific susceptibility, increased early life susceptibility to Chromium-6 is assumed, and EPA applied age-dependent adjustment factors, ADFs, in accordance with the supplemental guidance for assessing susceptibility from early life exposure to carcinogens, and citing EPA guidelines 2005.
Okay, we're all clear on this one? Looks like it. Okay, we'll move on.
Okay, charge question 6, part C. EPA concluded that for cancer via the oral route of exposure, Chromium-6 is likely to be carcinogenic to the human GI tract. This conclusion is primarily based on robust evidence of cancer from a high confidence 2-year cancer bioassay conducted by NTP, which showed a statistically significant increase in oral cavity tumors in male and female 344N rats and small intestine neoplasms in male and female B6CF-C3 F1 mice. And then it cites NTP 2008. Part D, a PUD from NTP 2008, a 2-year drinking water bioassay in rodents, was selected to calculate a total lifetime OSF for Chrome-6 of 0.5 per milligram kilogram per day based on increased incidence of adenomas and carcinomas in the small intestine of male and female mice. This value includes application of ADFs.
Okay, are there any questions? Seeing none, we'll move on.
Okay. E. The inhalation unit risk IUR was based on an occupational cohort by Gibb et al. 2020, 2015, and 20B of chromate production workers at a facility in Baltimore, Maryland. Cox proportional hazard modeling of cumulative chromium exposure and lung cancer risk with exposure lag by 5 years was used to estimate the PUD at the exposure concentration that would cause a 1% extra risk of lung cancer in the US population, resulting in an IUR for Chrome-6 of 2 × 10⁻² per microgram Chrome-6 meter cubed, including application of ADAFs.
All right, any questions? Nope, okay.
Oh, we're done.
We did it. Okay, well, we won't let you off the hook. I'll ask everyone, now that we've done them all, are there any final questions from the panel about the charges? I think we're okay. Oh, no, Dr. Beck has one. Barbara?
Yeah, I have a quick question which occurred to me with respect to the first charge question about additional studies. And I wasn't quite sure how would they be incorporated? Would there be a revised document? Does the SAB come back? How does that work?
Can we maybe go back to that slide and look at that footnote?
Oh, darn, we should have read it.
So newly identified studies, that would be studies identified by EPA or the public that met PICO criteria. So first they would be screened according to PICO criteria, but we're not addressed in the external review draft, for example, due to recent publication, will be characterized by EPA and presented to the peer review panel. This characterization will focus on EPA's judgment of whether the studies would have a material impact on the conclusions. And here we're talking about the identified hazard or toxicity values in the external review draft. The peer review panel is asked to review EPA's characterization and provide tiered recommendations to EPA regarding which studies, if any, to incorporate into the assessment before finalizing. So there is, again, sort of a screening according to PICO, and then there's a determination about whether EPA thought the study was going to have a material impact on the hazard conclusion or toxicity values.
Okay, so I understand this to mean that there will be another round of interaction between SAB and EPA with respect to how you determine the impact of new studies. Is that right?
Well, and I'm going to sort of open it up to my team here, but I would say that, again, the studies here are identified by EPA or the public that met PICO criteria. So really it would be that maybe, but it depends on whether sort of any new studies would be identified.
Okay. But if
and then again, sort of sequencing it on the further discussions, if there are, then we would sort of evaluate them in sort of the manner outlined in the footnote. And then if it looked like, and then the panel would weigh in about whether, our determination about whether it was going to have a material impact or not was reasonable. And then, the panel could weigh in about whether the studies need to be incorporated before finalizing.
Okay, that was my question. It sounds like there will be another, or there could be another round of discussion with the SAB based on your interpretation of the newly published studies.
And let me go ahead and open it up to Andrew Kraft, Associate Division Director.
Hello. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Kraft. I'm Chris's associate. So this is really referring to studies that were brought to our attention after we released the public comment draft. So this would have been newly published studies, for example, that maybe were not in the external review draft that were then characterized by EPA and the comment characterization, or if they're raised during the external peer review, if it's brought to your attention that there's, a 2023 study that's really impactful, that you would then alert us to that and we would characterize it, and then you would recommend whether or not that should be incorporated into the draft before it's finalized. So these would be newer studies, and then you would provide a disposition on whether or not and to what extent they should be incorporated to the draft before you finalize it. It wouldn't be another draft that's produced at this point, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Dr. Eastman.
Yes, I had a question. This is maybe one of sort of what's allowable and what isn't. So for example, in the public comments, Dr. Sam Cohen made some comments about sort of histology, pathology, and genotoxicity, which seem to be directly relevant to the mode of action considerations. And I think I got his arguments, and I'll try and put that together with what's written in the draft. But if I can't make sense of it, is it allowable for me to reach out to Dr. Cohen or get clarification on that? Or should I not reach out to him? I guess that's the same sort of thing with other comments that are made or other questions I have.
Sue, this one's probably for you.
Yeah, I thought it was for Sue.
Yeah. I think we would preferably it would be through me so that I can keep a record of those interactions. So if you have questions for Dr. Cohen, you can send those to me and I will reach out to Dr. Cohen, and I'll be sort of the go-between between you
Okay.
and him.
That's helpful. Thanks, Sue. I'd forgotten about that option, so that makes it possible. Thanks.
Right.
Dr. Lash.
Yeah, maybe this is for a little later, but when our next steps. But I was wondering about how much, if in responding to the charge questions, do we have to respond to the public comments that we've received, or it's just for extra consideration? Because some of the public comments are quite lengthy. So I'm wondering how much we have to take those into account, or how specifically.
This is a Sue question, right?
Sue question.
Yeah. So EPA responds to public comments, SAB does not. We will take those into consideration, or you as the panel members will take those into consideration as you're developing your responses to the charge questions. Whatever you find to be relevant to your, as you go through and read the document and read the assessments that are provided to you by the public. If you find, as Dr. Eastman has noted, he found some of Dr. Cohen's arguments compelling and wanted to possibly include them in his response to the carcinogenicity issue. If you find similar comments that are relevant to your area where you're responding, then, by all means, those should be included. But it's not a direct response to the public comments. It is take them into consideration as you are developing your responses.
Okay, yeah, it's just some of them are quite a bit. And it's a lot to go through after going through the 500-page document and the supplement, which is quite big.
Well, hopefully they were able to summarize them to the major issues that they're trying to elicit here.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Eastman, and then Mr. Haney.
Yeah, similar question. So this may be another question for Sue, but the other members could comment. So in the public comments, we received a number of these by email, which were the comments directly. We received a summary that was the EPA's compilation of the public comments. And I'm assuming that there's overlap on those. So for example, the comments from the American Chemistry Council appear to be identical in the EPA compilation and the one received independently. Is that but some public comments we didn't receive by email. I'm trying to figure out, are these all the ones that were submitted for this particular evaluation period, or are any of these carried forward from before?
And Sue, do you want to take that, or do you want me to ask the chemical managers to take that?
I can respond in terms of how we deal with public comments. So as our federal notices sort of try to explain, that the purpose of public comments to the agency is different than public comments to the SAB.
Okay.
For the agency's purpose, it is they will develop a response to comments in some manner to those public comments that they receive, and they will revise and adjust their assessment as they see fit. For us, it is those comments that are directly sent to the SAB and for your consideration as you develop your responses. We do not respond to public comments. That is, we do not create an appendix that goes through each public comment and try to give reasons why we agree or disagree with those comments. So there's a slight difference in purpose. Now, you did say that you've noticed that some of those comments that were submitted to the agency through the docket were also identical to the ones submitted to the SAB.
Okay.
You are correct, because some of our stakeholders are not very familiar with the process and think that once they've put it into an EPA quote unquote docket, that it has come to all parts of EPA, including the EPA Science Advisory Board. That is not correct. We have a separate process. We do not use dockets. We have all of our information is placed on our website, and we follow the rules of FACA, the Federal Advisory Committee Act. So anything that is brought to us directly will be shared with our panelists. And like I said, you are there. Those comments are for your consideration. And you may use them as you see appropriate. But anything else that has been summarized by the folks in the IRIS program, they did provide to us a list of all the public comments that they've received through the docket, and you have access to them. If you feel like they've given you additional information or additional studies to think about, or additional methodologies or critiques of the assessment that the agency has done, and you feel that's important to your development of the response, then you can also, read through all of those comments and incorporate them into your responses. But like I said, we do not respond directly to public comments, and I'll let the IRIS folks add whatever they want to add.
No, Sue, that was very helpful, and now it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, Dr. Eastman, the public comments that were compiled by EPA, like that were received that was all for the public comment period for the IRIS, for the release of the public comment draft. And those are all in the docket. And so then when we compiled those comments, there's a list at the beginning that lists all of the comments that are included. And so they've all been included in that compiled comments document. So that could be like a reference, and we organized them by relevant charge question, but it was impossible. Like, we didn't attempt to summarize those comments because we didn't want to provide any, interpretation of the comments. I just wanted to provide some method to sort the comments by charge question. So that's like on the IRIS side, but that's available on the SAB website, I believe, as well.
So the summary we got were really the comments submitted to the EPA docket, and the ones we received individually were submitted to the SAB.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And a lot of times these are the same.
Same.
These are the same, but I don't think all of them are the same. So I wouldn't say that, but.
Okay, Mr. Haney, I think we.
Yes. So I've been part of other external expert peer review panels in the past where we were charged with reviewing all the public comments submitted, and so now and then also here today, I'm hearing there's a distinction between those submitted to SAB and then those that are just appear in the docket. But so my question is part of our charge to review all public comments that have been submitted either to EPA and or just to the docket. There's a variety of ones that were submitted in December. I've not reviewed all of them. So anyway, I'll just curious about whether our charge included review of all the public comments submitted.
Sue?
Yes, so the easiest way for you to know which comments to pay extra attention to is to go to the web page that is associated with this particular review. So I usually include that link, letting you know that all materials associated with this particular review activity, including the agendas and charge questions and et cetera, public comments is part of that. And if you go to that webpage, you will see all the public comments that have been submitted to me for your consideration. And I have shared those with you in separate emails. So those are the ones that have been sent directly to you as panel members. The other comments that have been submitted to the docket are those for EPA. Now, having said that, EPA also provided us with the summary table. And so if you want to see what is relevant to a particular charge question, and that's how they've sorted them out, their relevance to charge questions for this review. If you are interested in the types of issues that have been raised by stakeholders that are relevant to a specific charge question, then the docket is there for you to look at, but it is not a requirement that you do that. But obviously to have a complete and full picture of the universe of issues that are associated with this particular assessment as seen by various stakeholders, then the docket would have a more thorough or more robust set of public comments that you can look at.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. Yeah, that would be, so not part of the charge questions per se, but really up to sort of the committee discretion, and they're available for you to look at.
Yeah, and for Dr. Eastman, Dr. Cohen suggests that you take a look at his written comments. And he thought that if you looked at his written comments first, and then if you had any additional questions, please do reach out to me and I can reach out to him.
Okay, so if I'm not mistaken, his written comments were addressed to the EPA, not specifically SAB, but I have access to them, so I will do that.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Are there any other questions? All right. Thank you, Dr. Thayer.
Can I just make one sort of final, not to beat it too much, but a little bit, there was quite a bit of sort of questions about the charge questions in terms of the sequencing. Foundationally, what we're looking at is peer review on our key assessment division. So we sort of decision. So we understand that the sequencing, how you might sort of unpack them I'm not sure if there is a perfect approach for a, sort of a complex assessment, but foundationally, we're trying to sort of look for feedback on those core assessment decisions, if that helps.
Okay, thank you. All right, so moving on in the agenda, we're almost there. I'll talk a little bit about next steps of where we are. So the next step for the committee is to prepare their preliminary comments and to send them to Sue by March 15th. We probably should all be aware that the preliminary comments are considered to be public documents, so the public does have access to them. So you might want to consider that when you write them. So they should get to Sue by March 15th, and then she'll try to collate them and assemble them and send up the parts to the various teams so that the teams can see all of the input that's relevant to them. And then the team leaders will try to put together some preliminary documents, a summary of those. And at the face-to-face, the team leader will lead the discussion before the committee, and then we'll open it up to questions from each member of the team and then questions from the entire panel. And that we will work through everything and try to come to consensus with respect to our final conclusions and final recommendations. And then we'll put together a draft document, which will go out to the entire committee, and we'll meet at least once more to go over the draft. So that's pretty much the process. For those of you that haven't done this before, when we finalize our recommendations, it'll go to the SAB, and the SAB might come back to us with additional questions, or they may not. There is the possibility that they may come back to us for some clarification. We'll just cross that bridge when we come to it. So that's just an outline of where we are. Are there any questions on what's needed or deadlines?
Is there any expectation that we coordinate with the other members who are assigned to the same charge questions at this point, or will that happen at our meeting?
Sue, what do you think about that? Does the team leader coordinate that?
I don't, at this point, it's not necessary. These are the preliminary comments. So basically the lead will be tasked with at the meeting when the deliberations occur to sort of try to take in all the various perspectives. And then after that meeting, the in-person meeting, then you go back and try to create that final draft response, and then working within your team, sort of create the response that you feel is appropriate, that takes into account both the public comments as well as the deliberations, as well as everybody's input, and creating a cohesive response to the charge question. And then we'll come back to that once we have a draft report, which I and Dr. Morris will be putting together in preparation for another teleconference where the entire panel will come together and look at all the responses, and we'll start editing at that point and making sure that we've captured everyone's comments, thoughts, recommendations, and advice into that. So at this stage, we're just in the preliminary comments phase. So everybody can respond to all charge questions. I will resend to you the table that has the assignments, the current assignments that were sent out in the chair's memo earlier. There have been just a few changes, and I'll send that table out as soon as we're done here today, along with the milestones. Yes.
Dr. Costa's chomping at the bit here. You have something, Matt?
I have a question. Is there any place where the charge questions are, I can get to them? Because I don't have a copy of the charge questions. They were just presented, but I don't know where a copy of them exists.
the link that I provide in most of my emails takes you to the meeting page where all of that information is located. So the agenda for today's meeting, the charge questions, the document itself that we are reviewing, all the public comments that have been sent to me and that I have forwarded to each of you, all of that information is on that one page. And if you go through it, you should be able to find what you're looking for.
I looked there. I didn't see the charge questions. I mean, I saw the other things you talked about, but I guess
It was actually also part of the chair's memo itself. It was there with each of the assignments.
Well, I know the
to-
assignments. I have that. I just don't. The assignments don't give me the charge questions. The assignments give you topics.
Before the table, the actual charge questions are there with the names that are associated with that charge question.
Oh,
So
okay.
before you get to the table, all of that information, I believe like 8 pages of charge questions.
Okay.
But I can send that along as well.
Yeah, just put it in the email you send out.
Yes, I will do.
That would be great.
Mhm.
Dr. Lash?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify then my understanding that, so for the lead so we're assigned as team members for different questions and sub-questions. So we submit our preliminary comments to Sue, and then Sue will forward to the lead discussant for all the comments. And what we'll do is then discuss them, present them at the meeting, and then where my goal as the lead discussant for question 3 would be to sort of put them all together, and rather than have like a set of comments from individual 1 and individual 2, kind of meld them together if there's agreement, or say one member said this, one member said that, and also incorporate discussion of the whole group. So it'll be a single response. And that'll be after the meeting. Correct?
Right. I mean, at the meeting, we will ask you to sort of summarize what you've gotten up to that point. So yeah, just a general summary, like you said, where there is agreement, where you find disagreement, maybe highlight a few of those as well. And then the actual writing and synthesizing will probably happen after that meeting. And because you want to hear what the consensus is after the deliberations happen, then the actual writing will occur.
I just want to make sure what I have to do before the end of March, because I have grants for a study
You
section.
have a lot of parts to your question.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, and we hope to reach consensus at the meeting on all the issues. If we don't, we'll deal with it, but we hope to. Okay, Dr. Post?
I think my question got answered because I'm
Okay.
So we can finish writing up like the combined answer after the meeting. It all doesn't have to be done during the meeting. That was my question. I guess after you said.
Yep.
Yeah, after.
Okay.
Afterwards.
Thank you.
I want to encourage everyone to answer any and all questions and not just to limit yourself to the questions that you're assigned. Obviously, those will be the questions that we want you to focus on, but if you feel you have something to contribute to the other charge questions, by all means. And I will be sorting them according to charge question, as well as, the members. So it'll be sorted by member as well as charge question. And as Dr. Morris indicated, they will be part of the public record. So they will be posted on that webpage that I spoke about earlier. And let's see. Anything else? Anybody have any more questions?
Yeah, we're set, everyone? I think so. So I'm not allowed to adjourn this, but Sue, you are.
Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, then we are adjourned until our in-person meeting. And by the way, the in-person meeting is a hybrid. So some folks may not feel comfortable in traveling and may wish to remain at their home stations. So we do have a Zoom option for those of you who do not want to travel. But, we do have the option to meet in person. And you will be contacted by someone from the EPA travel office to prepare those travel arrangements for you. Okay.
Okay.
Very good.
Thank you, everybody.
all.